The case of Darlie Routier is one of the most tragic and painstaking death row investigations I have encountered in the entirety of my legal career. What began as a simple analysis of a case that had been described to me as an open and shut conviction entirely devoid of reasonable doubt transformed into several months of an arduous investigation, culminating in an unexpected discovery of new evidence. Evidence that until now has never been previously reported. Details that would go on to reframe my understanding of Darlie's case, as well as the entirety of the criminal justice system. Several months ago, I started my analysis of the infamous death row case, having very little prior knowledge concerning the details surrounding it. After my initial assessment of the facts, I, like many others before me, adopted a clear position concerning her guilt and conviction, but then I began to read the court transcripts, as well as the supporting records, and what I found on those pages revealed a deeply disconcerting legal debacle unlike anything I have seen in years, the ramifications of which we will discuss at length today.
Do you think their case was damaged when Darlie took the stand in her own defense?
Yeah, I think it was damaged because, it gave us an opportunity to show the jury the real Darlie Routier.
I think what they saw is a person who cares about one thing, and that's themselves. And she was exposed for being a liar. And anytime you can expose a defendant for being a liar, if it's a circumstantial evidence case, the jury is going to be much more likely to convict.
And it is my belief that what I'm about to show you in today's video is a story that has yet to be told in its entirety until now. On June 6, 1996, at 2:31 a.m., the Rowlett, Texas Police Department received a frantic call from the Routier home. Darlie Routier had called 911 in a frenzy after she and her two boys had suffered catastrophic injuries at the hands of an alleged intruder, a crime that would claim both boys' lives. Minutes after law enforcement arrived, the responding officers would begin surveying the scene and quickly established a strong and unwavering opinion that the person responsible for this vicious attack was not an intruder, but the boys' own mother, Darlie Lynn Routier. Over the course of the next few weeks, law enforcement began an aggressive investigation that sought to prove their primary theory that Darlie had perpetrated these unspeakable acts against her own children. Within a few short weeks, the case the state had built against Darlie was already considerable, but law enforcement would inadvertently receive one of the most important elements of their case, gift wrapped in a box, covered in dollar store silly string by none other than their primary suspect herself, Darlie Routier.
For some, this may seem a strange thing to do in an odd place and time.
Happy birthday, dear Devin.
Singing happy birthday in a cemetery to a son who was brutally stabbed to death just over a week ago.
Love you, Devin and Damon.
But Darlie and Darren Routier say this is appropriate for them and their family.
It was a crime of moral ineptitude, caught on camera, that would all but guarantee that a jury would convict Darlie beyond any reasonable doubt. And just 7 months later, the weight of that video would help to convict Darlie Routier for the homicide of her son Damon Routier, and her sentence by the jury was the death penalty. In the years following her trial, the general public remained fairly confident over the veracity of her conviction. However, over time, that sentiment has started to change. While many have never doubted her guilt, others believe that she was not afforded a fair and unbiased trial. And now that the Innocence Project has agreed to represent Darlie, many have started to question the case that was brought against her at trial. But for the 53-year-old death row inmate who has exhausted most of her remaining appeals, the inescapable reality is that she is quickly running out of time. In today's video, we will analyze the case brought against Darlie at trial by the prosecution, and then we will carefully review the evidence that has arisen in support of her innocence. We will examine the court records, the evidence, the testimony, and the surrounding facts of her case as we try to piece together a fragmented puzzle of this American tragedy. And when I have placed all of the pieces of the puzzle out for you to see, I will show you the lost puzzle piece that I found buried in an area that no one thought to look, evidence that was seemingly stored away, misunderstood, and forgotten. And it's what I found in that evidence that caused me to fundamentally change my understanding and view of the case brought against Darlie Routier. So today I would like to invite you to come with me down this winding rabbit hole and go back in time to a small East Texas town in the conservative center of the Bible Belt as we try to uncover the truth of what happened that terrible June night inside of the Routier home. This is a death row inmate or a mother running out of time, the Darlie Routier case, Episode 1. Now, before we begin, there's something very important that I need to cover first. From the very first day that I began my analysis into Darlie's case, I immediately noticed the sheer volume of documentaries and related media that has been created since Darlie's conviction, with the prevailing view of that media and the general public widely in support of Darlie's conviction. Now, while that wasn't surprising or unexpected, what was concerning to me is the discourse that surrounds this case. Please allow me to explain. I realize that many people who have studied this case and are familiar with the facts surrounding it have very strong beliefs concerning her conviction. And it's precisely because of those strong convictions that you don't have to look far to see people throughout the entirety of the internet angrily attacking anyone who tries to analyze this case from a contrary or an objective standpoint. But reviewing this case from an objective standpoint is exactly what I intend to do today, primarily because I believe there are vital legal and societal issues that stem from Darlie's conviction that we cannot afford to ignore. So instead of creating a documentary that largely repeats the same facts that you have already heard, a story that ultimately arrives at the same conclusion, I wanted to take a vastly different approach in today's video, to tell you both sides of this case as completely and as thoroughly as I can. Early on in my analysis, I realized something critically important about this case. The matter of Darlie Routier strikes at the heart of our very humanity because it doesn't just involve a crime against the innocent, it is something far worse. It is a horrific and unpardonable offense against children. And it is the nature of this crime that calls upon our human nature to demand justice and instills in each of us the desire to want to take up arms against the perpetrator and dole out that justice ourselves for a crime that we can all agree was truly reprehensible and completely unforgivable. But the criminal justice system was created as a beacon of objectivity, blind and impartial, where the truth and evidence is the ultimate guide in how and when we dole out that justice, where our righteous and understandable anger is mitigated by the impartiality of a system that weighs in the balance whether or not someone lives or dies, a system of justice predicated on the notion that we are innocent until proven guilty beyond any reasonable doubt, where our need for retribution and punishment does not guide our judges or our prosecutors, and most especially our juries, but that we allow the truth to dictate how and when we make the most severe of those judgments. And that isn't merely a lofty idea that we hope exists within our courts and judicial corridors, but objectivity, fairness, and the truth are the very tenets of the American criminal justice system. So today, as we evaluate both sides of the Darlie Routier case, I am asking each of you to play a very important role. I am asking you to review this case as an impartial juror, as though you have been chosen to make the final determination at her trial, to sit in the seat of judgment and to fairly evaluate both sides of the evidence. Additionally, I will share with you vitally important legal issues that I have identified in my own evaluation of her case. And at the conclusion of this video, you will be called upon to decide, to determine her guilt or her innocence. So today, I invite you to take notes, listen closely, and most importantly, withhold judgment until you have heard all of the facts from both sides in their entirety. And when the totality of the evidence has been presented, you will be asked to make your final judgment, and to answer the following questions. 1. Is Darlie Routier guilty beyond any reasonable doubt? And 2. Does Darlie Routier deserve the death penalty? I believe that the answer to these questions is one of the most important and solemn responsibilities within our criminal justice system, and today you have been called upon to make that choice. So with that as our guide, let's begin. The June summer air was hot and sticky that evening in the small conservative East Texas town of Rowlett. The spacious Routier home had finally started to settle as Darren took baby Drake upstairs in an effort to give Darlie a long overdue and much needed reprieve. It had been months since Darlie could remember getting more than a few hours of rest before being woken up, and after months of sleep deprivation, financial stressors, and familial disputes, the young mother was nearing a mental and emotional collapse. The last few months since Drake's birth had been particularly brutal. Getting him to sleep through the night had been a near constant struggle. Most of the time, she would be lucky to string together a few hours of sleep before it was time to get up and do it all over again. To add to her ongoing stress, she had struggled with losing the baby weight that she had gained during her pregnancy with Drake. But thankfully, she had heard of an immensely popular diet pill called Fen-Phen that her doctor had been more than happy to prescribe. By early June, she had been taking the diet pills for several months. And while they did seem to help, it wasn't the miracle drug that she had been hoping for. But if all that wasn't enough, the young family had hit a rough patch that had seemingly affected every area of their lives. Darren's once exceedingly successful business had seen an unexpected downturn, and things weren't as comfortable financially as they had been before. As a result, the couple seemed to find themselves in more frequent and explosive arguments over money. But that wasn't the only thing bothering Darlie. She felt different, and despite her best efforts to ignore it, she just didn't feel like herself anymore. Her relationship with Darren was reaching a critical mass from the financial and emotional stress. She found herself lashing out at him more frequently over his inattentive nature with their boys, and while she loved him, she knew things could not stay the same, and the weight of that realization was becoming untenable. In the preceding days, she had found herself unable to keep from crying, feeling despondent, and she knew that something was very wrong. One afternoon, she began feverishly writing in her journal words that felt honest, and yet part of her couldn't believe that she was effectively writing a letter telling her family goodbye. It was shocking to her because the words on that page were the truth, a truth that was about to become front-page news for all the world to see. No one can know with absolute certainty the exact events of what transpired in the minutes and hours preceding 2:31 a.m. at the Routier home. But what we do know is that shortly after 1 a.m. on June 6, 1996, Darlie Routier went downstairs with her boys, Devin and Damon, to sleep in the family living room. And what transpired over the next 90 minutes in the Routier home would radically alter the course of their lives forever. At 2:31 a.m., 911 dispatchers for the Rowlett Police Department received a desperate and hysterical call from 5801 Eagle Drive, the home of Darren and Darlie Routier. Within the first few seconds of the call, Darlie can be heard shouting for help to the 911 operator. Initially, the 911 dispatcher was unable to clearly understand Darlie, but 23 seconds after the call began, the operator requests EMS and law enforcement to respond to the scene for an unknown medical emergency at 5801 Eagle Drive. At nearly 30 seconds into the call, Darlie frantically tells the operator,
"Ma'am, I'm trying to get an ambulance to you. Hang on a minute."
51 seconds in, the operator can be heard communicating to first responders. At the 1 minute and 24 second mark, Darlie can be heard communicating to her husband, Darren. Just 32 seconds later, 2 minutes into the call, Darlie is asked by the operator to explain what happened, and Darlie provides her first detailed explanation of the crime.
What is going on? Somebody came in the hall. I was sleeping. Me and my little boys were sleeping downstairs. Stand there, baby. Stand there. Look up. I was crying. We ran out to the garage. They're not dead. My daughters are dying. They're dead. Oh, my God.
At approximately 2:32 a.m., just 2 minutes after Darlie initiated the call to 911, responding officer David Waddell of the Rowlett Police Department would arrive on scene. At 2 minutes and 38 seconds into the call, the operator asks Darlie for additional information.
Is there anybody in the house besides you and your children? My baby's just right downstairs. He's helping me, but he's dying. Oh, my God. Okay.
Now 3 minutes into the call, we can hear Darlie impatiently asking for the status of the already en route paramedics.
5801 Eagle Drive, 5801 Eagle Drive. It's going to be a stabbing. When are they going to be here? Ma'am, they're on their way.
And again 30 seconds later, Darlie expresses urgency at the timeliness of the still inbound EMS responders.
Please hurry. God, they're taking forever.
One of the next things we hear in the recording is Officer Waddell instructing Darlie to look for a rag to help provide emergency medical assistance to her gravely injured sons. It would later be revealed at trial that the confusion happening in this call was due to the fact that Darlie was heard communicating to Officer Waddell in between speaking with the 911 operator. But at the 4-minute mark of the call, Darlie can be heard initially speaking to Officer Waddell and then the operator about the alleged intruder.
They left the knife laying up. There's a knife. Don't press anything. I already cut their faces up.
And just seconds later, Darlie again asks for the status of the still incoming paramedics.
There's a police officer at your front door. Is your front door unlocked? Okay.
Nearing the end of the call, Darlie is again heard describing her reaction to the alleged intruder.
Oh, my God. Oh, my God. Why would they do this?
But this next interaction at the 5-minute mark and subsequent conversation between Darlie Routier, Officer Waddell, and the 911 operator would become the bedrock of the state's case against her. A moment that has been widely viewed as one of the most initially important elements of establishing the suspicion that would ultimately lead to Darlie's arrest. At 5 minutes and 19 seconds, Darlie speaks to her husband Darren and is heard discussing the intruder.
Hang on a second. We walked in here and did it, Darren. Okay.
Shortly after Darlie was instructed to end the call with the 911 operator, EMS and additional law enforcement would begin to arrive at the scene. After a short wait outside while law enforcement secured the scene, the EMTs were eventually given clearance and rushed inside the Routier home, quickly assessing the gravely injured Routier boys. In a matter of moments, they realized the catastrophic severity of the injuries the boys had sustained. Tragically, Devin was already beyond medical intervention by the time paramedics arrived. As a result of his injuries, he would be pronounced at the scene, and the attending paramedic would have to move on to the other injured family members. After a brief assessment, EMTs would rush Damon and Darlie to Baylor Medical Center to receive emergency medical care. Despite the EMTs' best efforts, Damon would not survive the devastating injuries he had sustained. Tragically, he would be pronounced shortly after he arrived at the hospital, but EMTs had been unsuccessful in regaining any of his vital signs en route. While still at the Routier home, law enforcement quickly began surveying the scene to try and locate any evidence of the intruder Darlie had identified in her initial call. At first, law enforcement would find evidence that seemed consistent with Darlie's claims of an intruder, including the living room coffee table having been moved, a broken wine glass in the kitchen, and a knocked-over vacuum cleaner. Law enforcement would also find evidence that initially seemed consistent with a break-in inside the garage, which had a screen door window that had been cut. But after scouring the Routier's neighborhood without finding any signs of an intruder, investigators would eventually secure a sock found nearly 80 yards away from the Routier home. The sock that they had found would later test positive for blood from the Routier boys, as well as DNA from both Darlie and Darren, but testing did not reveal any foreign or unknown DNA from anyone other than the Routier family. After further assessment of the available evidence at the crime scene by a tenured crime scene analyst, law enforcement developed significant concerns with Darlie's story and her claims of an intruder. Their concerns stem from the view of the evidence concerning an alleged intruder, but more specifically, the lack thereof. Despite their suspicions, law enforcement opted to wait for Darlie's initial statement after surgery to try and ascertain the true nature of this crime. A short time after Darlie awoke from surgery, she would provide law enforcement with her initial written statement. However, the details she gave would only raise their suspicions of her involvement. Homicide detectives were struck at the lack of detail in her report and her inability to offer any reasonable description of the perpetrator, beyond telling them that he wore jeans, a ball cap, and a dark t-shirt. The lack of any considerable description of the intruder's facial features were only compounded when CSI investigators at the scene noticed that if an intruder had been present, that they had failed to take anything from the home, including Darlie's extensive jewelry collection that was downstairs in plain view. As investigators began to try and piece together the details of her statement, they began to realize that her version of events were inconsistent with what they were seeing at the crime scene. And it would be fair to say that from the very beginning, Darlie Routier was the primary suspect in connection with this brutal crime, and the Rowlett Police Department was certain that they had the right person in their sights. And from that point forward, they focused all of their resources into pursuing their primary suspect in connection with this unspeakable crime against the Routier boys. In the initial days following the attack, law enforcement began to dive into Darren and Darlie's life, eventually opting to begin surveilling their day-to-day movements. But their investigation would be gifted one of the most important elements of their case by the local news media at the site of Damon and Devon's funeral. Without prompting, Darlie Routier gave the police one of the most important pieces of the case that prosecutors would eventually use against her. This moment was captured in the hours after the Routiers had conducted a private family funeral for both boys and was recorded by the local news. After this segment was aired, the response from the general public was pure and unadulterated outrage. Those who viewed the broadcast were stunned and disgusted that a mother who had just lost her eldest boys could demonstrate such an irreverent and careless display. It would go on to become the final piece of the puzzle the prosecution needed to arrest their sole suspect in connection with this inhuman crime. And just 4 days after this infamous silly string video was taken at the site of her boy's funeral, Darlie Lynn Routier was arrested for the first-degree homicides of her 2 eldest boys, Devon and Damon Routier. The state would waste no time in pursuing their case against her, and just 6 months later, the trial of Darlie Routier began. With their mandate from the public in hand, the prosecutors would stop at nothing to ensure Darlie's swift and just conviction at any and all costs. The trial of Darlie Routier began exactly 6 months to the day after the homicides of her sons, with the first day of trial beginning on January 6, 1997. The state's case was led by prosecutors Toby Shook and Greg Davis, who were tenured and experienced litigators, men who understood the intricacies of the courtroom, and as those who have practiced law know, trial work is an art form. The trial itself would last for nearly 5 weeks, which included dozens of witnesses, experts, and testimony from members of the community, as well as friends and family of the Routiers. Now, in the interest of time and due to the sheer size and scope of the trial record, I'm going to summarize the primary points that were brought against Darlie by the state. You will hear the core evidence as it was shown to the jury in January of 1997, but remember, you're going to be hearing both sides of this case, including new details that the jury was never told. The following is the case brought forward by the state's prosecutors against their defendant, Darlie Lynn Routier. An arrest warrant is the legal basis by which the state or law enforcement agency is granted authority by a presiding judge to detain, arrest, and eventually prosecute a criminal defendant. And in the matter of Darlie Routier, the arrest warrant contained many of the main tenets of the state's case that would eventually be brought against her at trial. It is not uncommon to see arrest warrants that cover a wide variety of criminal infractions as supported by the available evidence that are intended to depict the legal basis for why the state is pursuing charges against the accused. Now, it's important to remember that a defendant does not need to be found not guilty of every claim of wrongdoing associated with the specific charge, but if any modicum of reasonable doubt is established at trial, then the law demands that the defendant be acquitted of that charge. And with that in mind, prosecutors Toby Shook and Greg Davis were careful to bring the most viable case against Darlie Routier, and intentionally only pursued the criminal action for the homicide of Damon and not Devin. This legal maneuver allowed for them to pursue a crime eligible for capital punishment due to the boy's age. Despite the overwhelming consensus by the general public concerning Darlie's guilt at the time, these experienced prosecutors knew from the beginning that motive would be a considerable issue for their case. While the state does not need to prove motive, it cannot, however, be ignored. And in Prosecutor Greg Davis's opening, he outlined for the jury the indictment and case against Darlie Lynn Routier. But these are the primary tenets of criminality brought against her during her trial. Number 1, Darlie Routier was materialistic, vain, and demonstrated behavior unbecoming of a mother. Number 2, Darlie's statements were inconsistent and appeared to contain evidence of a cover-up. Number 3, Darlie failed to provide any medical assistance to her children at the scene of the crime. 4, law enforcement was unable to find evidence of an intruder. Number 5, forensic evidence found inside the Routier house showed signs of a staged crime scene. Number 6, Darlie's wounds were deemed medically superficial and were inconsistent with the severity of the injuries sustained by Damon and Devin, injuries that were believed to have been self-inflicted. Since these were the primary claims made by prosecutors, we will now begin to analyze each claim brought forward by the state. From the opening statements of the trial, the prosecution quickly set the stage for the jury concerning the character of Darlie Routier. She was regularly and repeatedly described as a vapid, selfish, and absent-minded mother who was so motivated by greed and material possessions that she ended the lives of her 2 eldest boys out of rage, convenience, and ultimately for financial gain in the form of their tandem $5,000 life insurance policies. The following is an exact quote from Prosecutor Greg Davis's opening statement that he spoke to the jury at the commencement of Darlie's trial. Quote, "And perhaps most importantly, the evidence will show you that the money train from Darren's business was beginning to peter out. When we come to June 5th, 1996, the evidence is going to show you that those problems began to worsen, and they have worsened over time. By that date, the defendant right over there still had not lost the weight that she had gained during her pregnancy. And that had led her by June 5th, 1996, to begin taking pills in order to try and get back that figure. She was no longer the glamorous, blonde center of attention by that date. By this time, Drake was 8 months old. Drake, Devin, and Damon were taking up more and more of her time. And by this time, she was becoming angry. Because in fact, her lifestyle that she had grown accustomed to, the vacations, the buying sprees, the nice things, the freedom, those things were starting to go away." Unquote. During the trial, several people would testify for the prosecution speaking to the character of Darlie Routier, and most importantly, her behavior as a mother. This included testimony by Allison Hennessy, who told the jury that she witnessed Darlie routinely allow her very young children to play outside near the street unsupervised, including allowing their babysitter to drink alcohol and smoke cigarettes, despite the fact that she was only 16 years old. A neighbor, Eileen Shermer, also testified for the state and against Darlie concerning an incident where in the summer of 1994, the Routiers had invited her and her children out to the lake on their boat. The Routier boys were only 4 and 5 years old and were not yet competent swimmers. Eileen attempted to express concern to Darlie about the fact that they weren't wearing life preservers, but were still allowed to run around the docks unsupervised. Eileen would testify that neither Darlie nor Darren seemed to pay any attention to her concerns about their children's safety. She would go on to testify about how she too had seen the children running around outside unsupervised, even going out of view of Darlie, riding their bikes in the street where they could have easily been injured by oncoming cars. Eileen explained to the jury that when she expressed these concerns to Darlie, she was met with a cold and muted antipathy, virtually ignoring her concerns altogether. Several other instances were discussed at trial that seemed to paint Darlie as a cold, at times unkind and borderline abusive, distant mother, someone who appeared to lack the attentiveness and care indicative of a loving and responsible mother. 2 minutes into Darlie Routier's initial phone call to 911, she is clearly heard giving her initial description of an alleged intruder. She explains that he attacked her children, then her, that she was fighting with him, and then he ran out through the garage, throwing the knife down as he fled. A short time later, after Darlie is told by the 911 operator not to touch anything, we hear Darlie making a highly unusual comment about having already picked up the knife, saying, and I quote, "God, I bet if we could have gotten the prints, maybe." Prosecutor Shook explained to the jury just how problematic that comment was, chiding Darlie, a mother who had just somehow slept through the vicious and brutal attack of her 2 young boys, asleep mere feet away while it transpired, and is now minutes later seemingly more concerned about the alleged intruder's fingerprints than she is her own critically wounded children. Darlie had even described herself as a light sleeper and had told law enforcement that she went to sleep downstairs that evening precisely because of the fact that baby Drake woke her up so often throughout the night. But when Darlie would eventually testify during the trial, she was unable to provide any explanation for how she could have stayed asleep during this brutal attack. But most problematic to Darlie's case were the inconsistencies and ongoing alterations to her version of events, and prosecutors were able to demonstrate to the jury how Darlie's story frequently changed over time. What she had initially told the 911 operator had changed to something entirely different less than 48 hours later when she provided her initial statement to law enforcement. In her written statement, she now describes being woken up by Damon pressing on her right shoulder, hearing him cry, and then realizing that a man that she couldn't even describe was standing at the foot of her couch. There was no mention of the fight that she had described in her initial call to 911, and unfortunately for her, prosecutors would outline every new and altered iteration of her story to the jury, which by all accounts was a story that changed 8 different times. Darlie's defense in response to these issues could effectively be described as amnesia, but the problem with that defense was Darlie herself. Because in the weeks following the brutal attacks, Darlie would send letters to friends and family members with a more detailed description of the attacker, including accusations of a specific person that she believed had to have been responsible. But at her trial, Darlie would admit that he could not have been the perpetrator, and her defense claims of amnesia became virtually impossible to defend. One of the most highly problematic elements of Darlie's trial arose from the testimony of first responders. Prosecutors were able to establish from Officer Waddell's testimony, as well as the taped 911 recording, that upon arriving, he instructed Darlie to apply pressure to Damon's wounds. Officer Waddell testified that she seemingly ignored his instruction, choosing instead to remain focused on the 911 call and her own injuries. A short time later, he would again tell her to get towels to help treat Damon's injuries, something that can be heard during the recorded call. But again, Darlie would not respond and continued to hold a towel to her own neck. Now, this would be challenged by the defense at trial, including testimony from both Darlie and Darren claiming that Darlie had been wetting towels and placed them on Damon's back prior to Officer Waddell's arrival. Darren would also testify that Darlie had helped him hold Damon's back wounds while he was providing first aid prior to the first responders' arrival. However, during the trial, the paramedic who was first to enter the scene testified that he saw no towels on Damon from the moment he walked through the door. And this testimony would have a profound effect on the jury, because by this point, they had already heard considerable circumstantial evidence of Darlie's questionable behavior as a mother prior to the events of June 6th. But what continued to work against Darlie's defense was the incontrovertible fact that if her story was true, that she had slept through the attacks and then failed to provide first aid to her gravely injured sons. Now, I wanted to take a brief moment to provide you with some insight into my analysis at this moment of my investigation. When I began reviewing the extensive history of this case, I intentionally started with the various documentaries, podcasts, and YouTube videos that are firmly in support of her guilt. I wanted to know all of the primary issues that have been brought against her before I thoroughly reviewed the claims of her innocence. And I intentionally began this way because that was always how I approached any client's case that I worked on in my legal career. I would want to know exactly what I was up against before I started any work on developing a legal strategy for trial. But if I'm being completely transparent, when I arrived at this part of Darlie's case, being a father of 3 young children, I could not reconcile these issues. A mother who tells the world that she's a sound sleeper, who intentionally goes downstairs to sleep with her boys precisely because she wakes up so easily, is then somehow asleep through the brutal attacks of her children and the attacks against her as well? I understood why so many people are so passionate about their belief of her guilt, stemming from this issue alone. But that is exactly why I intentionally chose to remain objective, why I removed my own personal feelings and chose instead to continue to follow the evidence no matter where it led. And while we are still making our way through the state's case against her, remember, we are not even close to being done yet. So let's continue. James Cron was an experienced crime scene investigator who had worked on thousands of cases during his significant 39-year career. But prior to the events that had transpired the morning of June 6th at the Routier home, he had already gone into retirement. However, when the Rowlett Police Department's leadership became aware of the size and scope of the crime scene at 5801 Eagle Drive, they reached out to Mr. Cron and asked him to come out of retirement, and he agreed. During the trial, he would testify that within 20 to 30 minutes of arriving at the Routier home, he developed a strong suspicion that the crime scene had signs of being staged, and that their primary suspect was likely Darlie herself. Crime scene analysts began to survey the scene, taking into account the verbal statements that Darlie had provided the 911 operator, as well as the law enforcement officers who had arrived shortly thereafter. Initially, Cron would notice that the living room coffee table appeared to have been moved, that there was broken glass on the kitchen floor, as well as a vacuum cleaner that was now laying on its side. But he would eventually come to the conclusion that, coupled with the blood evidence found underneath these items, that they could not have occurred without purposeful intent and expressly for the purposes of staging the scene. Investigator Cron would testify that he and his team were unable to locate the kind of evidence consistent with the struggle in the manner that Darlie had described. Furthermore, they had not found blood evidence in the garage or the kind of shoe pattern evidence that you would expect to see from an intruder fleeing the scene, either in the garage, disturbed dust from the windowsill, impressions in the mulch, or blood evidence that they would expect to find from an intruder on the gate leading out of the Routier backyard. In the weeks and months following the crime, forensic analysts for the state would eventually test the various evidence taken from the crime scene, and they were unable to locate any foreign DNA from anyone other than the Routier family. During the trial, the lack of evidence supporting Darlie's claims was compounded by the fact that her lawyer failed to provide anything to the jury that would counter the state's expert testimony, who had provided forensic evidence that refuted. The forensic evidence found at the Routier home has largely been viewed as some of the most compelling brought forward by the prosecution during Darlie's trial. I could very easily spend several hours discussing it in great detail, but for the sake of brevity and so that this video isn't 14 hours long, I will cover the main points. If you recall, when investigator Cron arrived at the scene, he noticed a few things that he believed were out of place. Chief among them was the broken wine glass, the vacuum cleaner, and the visible blood evidence that didn't seem to match Darlie's story. During the 911 call, Darlie had mentioned that the intruder had dropped the knife in their utility room as he ran out of the house into the garage. But during Cron's investigation, he noticed that there wasn't a blood pattern consistent with the knife having been dropped from any height, let alone the height of a man who Darlie would later describe as being over 6 feet tall. Furthermore, the broken wine glass would again fail to support Darlie's statements. She had previously explained that while running towards the intruder, she had heard glass break. However, when crime scene investigators found the glass, they noticed that it was on top of the blood evidence, which suggested that the glass was broken after she had already been injured by what the state believed was a self-inflicted wound. The same pattern was found by Cron when he evaluated the evidence around and beneath the vacuum cleaner, which also had blood evidence and glass underneath it. Evidence that would again support the state's theory that it had been moved after the fact in an effort to try and stage the scene to show evidence consistent with an intruder. But it's what crime scene analysts found in the kitchen that brought the prosecution's primary case against Darlie into overdrive. Forensic analysts were able to use luminol around the kitchen sink that showed trace evidence consistent with someone in the Routier home cleaning up areas of the crime scene. Prosecutors would use this as proof that Darlie had intentionally inflicted her own wounds, staged the crime scene, and quickly tried to clean it up before law enforcement could arrive. But easily some of the most compelling evidence that was presented to the jury as the indisputable proof of Darlie's guilt would come from the family kitchen knife block. Analysts for the prosecution would testify that the bread knife found within it had tested positive for trace evidence in the form of fiberglass rods that prosecutors would explain to the jury were identical to the screen window fiberglass rods found in the family's garage. And with this forensic evidence in hand, the state would assert that this knife had to have been used to cut the garage screen door, which would completely eliminate the possibility of an intruder, since an intruder would have needed the bread knife to gain entry into the Routier home. And as a consequence of this devastating forensic evidence, it by extension would only further support the idea that Darlie had staged the crime scene herself. While the defense did cross-examine various state witnesses and experts, they were largely unsuccessful in providing any explanation to the jury that would explain the enormity of the evidence against their client. But there was still additional evidence that would become far more important to the jury. An unstoppable train picking up speed on a one-way destination headed straight for Darlie Routier. One of the most considerable hurdles the prosecution laid for the defense was the differentiation between the catastrophic injuries sustained by Damon and Devin and the fairly minor injuries Darlie suffered. The prosecution would call the various treating medical providers to the stand who testified to the fact that Darlie's neck wound was entirely superficial. The treating providers would also testify that the depth of her neck injury was minor enough that it would only require minor stitching to close and was nowhere near the severity of what the Routier boys had suffered. During their testimony, it was regularly repeated that her injuries were superficial, a term that was used so frequently in relation to Darlie's injuries that nearly 30 years later, it is one of the most widely known facts portrayed about Darlie's case. Additionally, experts would testify at trial that her injuries appeared to have been self-inflicted when compared to the evidence at the crime scene. Darlie's story was that she had sustained the injury to her neck while still laying on the couch. But during trial, prosecutors would point out to the jury the lack of blood evidence on the couch that in any way supported her claim. When taken in tandem with what investigators found at the sink, which included extensive amounts of pooled blood evidence, prosecutors explained to the jury that this was consistent with a self-inflicted injury over the kitchen sink that was entirely superficial and nowhere near the severity of what Damon and Devin endured. Now, to those of you who have previously watched my content, you are already likely aware of the fact that I intentionally steer away from discussing details that are uncharacteristically unsafe for young audiences. There are a number of reasons why I do this, but most of all, it is to honor the victims in this case. Since beginning this channel late last year, I have received dozens of comments from mothers and fathers alike who have thanked me for creating content with that in mind. Content that they are often able to enjoy in the company of their children, and I will continue to make this my focus for many years to come here on YouTube. Now, to those who are already familiar with this case, you are likely already aware of the specific details of what happened to the Routier boys, which has been discussed at length by virtually every documentary that has ever covered this horrific tragedy. Frankly, I don't want to contribute to that in this video. However, to those who are interested in studying this case further, I will provide additional resources in the description for your own personal analysis. But I will simply say this: what happened on June 6, 1996 is an unimaginable and horrific tragedy, and before I'm done with this video, I will do my best to honor the lives of Damon and Devin Routier and the happy, joyful, and full lives they lived. So with that said, let's continue. One of the most important moments of any jury trial is the closing arguments. A well-prepared closing can make or break your case, and no one understands that better than prosecutor Jeff Ashton. By the time he stood in front of the jury, he was so thoroughly convinced that he had won them over, that he had succeeded in establishing the guilt of the defendant, that he didn't even bother to try and establish the most important part of his case: guilt proven beyond any reasonable doubt. Many who have watched his closing arguments have noted that he appears arrogant, overly confident, and even seems to condescend to anyone who might think that the state had not succeeded in proving their case. And I imagine that was precisely why he was completely shocked when the jury read their verdict.
As to the charge of first-degree murder, verdict as to count 1, we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty.
A talented and experienced prosecutor understands that a well-constructed case is built on the foundation of evidence, forensics, expert witnesses, and facts, but every prosecutor, above all else, wants something even more difficult to achieve: winning the hearts and minds of the jury. It is an unspoken rule I have witnessed in more jury trials than most people will see in the entirety of their lives. But when a prosecutor succeeds in captivating the jury, guilt beyond any reasonable doubt is sure to follow.
Guilty verdict. Signed by the forelady, 3-2-23.
So when closing arguments began in the Darlie Routier case, the jury would first hear from prosecutor Toby Shook. He took it upon himself to do the heavy lifting by summarizing the evidence that the state had brought against Darlie over the preceding 5 weeks. He reminded the jury about the changing stories Darlie told law enforcement, medical professionals, family members, and even people she barely knew at least 8 different times. He explained the conflicting evidence found at the scene and the forensic experts who had testified to finding evidence consistent with the crime scene having been staged prior to law enforcement's arrival. He reminded them of the testimony that established Darlie's penchant for the finer things in life, her tendency to be materialistic, money-driven, and then told them that it was the state's opinion that this blonde bombshell who had paid $2,000 for breast augmentation had become so blinded by her pursuit of money that she was willing to do the unspeakable in exchange for her freedom and for the $10,000 in combined life insurance policies. He recapped the financial problems the couple had come upon, that they were on the brink of having their house foreclosed upon, that they were virtually broke, and that Darren's business was seemingly barely treading water. He revisited the stories of Darlie's apathy towards her own children after law enforcement had arrived at the scene, and the stories of those who testified that she never asked about the condition of either Damon or Devin. That despite the fact that Darlie had needed surgery, that her wounds were entirely superficial and that she was only ever in the ICU as a means to keep her away from the throngs of reporters and the public who had taken immediate interest in her case. He told the jury, again, to remember the testimony from the medical professionals who had described Darlie as whiny with a flat affect, not acting like a distraught and heartbroken mother who had just lost her 2 eldest boys, but rather like an uncaring and disconnected monster who must have been responsible for the crime. Prosecutor Shook reminisced with the jury concerning the testimony that came from blood expert Tom Bevel, who had testified to the blood drops on Darlie's shirt that he believed were consistent with Darlie having held the knife during the commission of the crime. He discussed the fact that the Routier's dog, who was known to bark at everyone the moment they stepped through the door, had remained quiet throughout the entirety of the vicious attack, how the security light in the backyard was not seen on at the time first responders arrived, and would have had to have been if an intruder had gone through the backyard, since it would stay on for 18 minutes after it was triggered. And how nothing in the house, not even the pile of jewelry sitting in plain view, was ever touched. He again reminded the jury that Darlie's injuries were minor when compared to those that her children suffered. He discussed the unlikeliness of an intruder breaking into the Routier home without bringing a weapon, instead taking one from the Routier's kitchen, something that was described as not only being improbable, but virtually impossible. He talked about Darlie's best friend of a decade, Barbara Jovel, and how she testified to how money changed Darlie, how she became self-centered, buying an extensive jewelry collection, decorating her home, buying boats, a spa, cars, and that she was the dominant, buxom blonde who spent thousands of dollars augmenting her body, that she was more than happy to show off to the world. Prosecutor Shook reminded the jury of one of the most damning pieces of evidence that Darlie's own defense team had failed to properly explain. Her journal entry, where she effectively told her family goodbye, that she just couldn't keep going anymore, apologizing for what she was about to do, and then a month later, the unimaginable. However, it's in the final moments of his closing arguments that Prosecutor Shook placed the final nail in the outer frame of Darlie's coffin when he reminded them of the now infamous silly string video. A video that the jury was about to watch and rewatch 7 different times during their 4-hour deliberation. A video that jurors would later admit carried more weight in their minds than virtually anything else that had been presented by the prosecution. Later on that same day, Prosecutor Greg Davis would have the opportunity to provide the jury with his own closing statement, but he wouldn't spend his time regaling the jury over the minutiae of the factual evidence nearly as much as he would try to achieve the one thing the state had wanted from the very beginning: hearts and minds. In his closing remarks, he compared Darlie to the likes of Susan Smith, a case that had also featured a mother who had initially claimed that someone else had been responsible for the unspeakable acts against her children, only to find out that she had been responsible all along. The Susan Smith case had inflamed a wildfire of vitriol and anger from the general public, and Prosecutor Davis made certain to draw that comparison to his defendant, who was still insisting on her innocence. In his closing, he also compared her to the likes of Charles Manson, taking time to remind the jury of Darlie's failures as a mother the morning of June 6th, failing to help her children despite being instructed to do so by first responders. But it was towards the end of his impassioned speech that he turned away from the jury and took aim at Darlie herself in a way that was designed to get her to respond. Prosecutor Davis understood that the state's case lacked a clear and uncontestable motive, but if he could somehow get Darlie to show the jury a moment of rage, then he could prove that she was capable of the crimes for which she now stood trial. These are some of the final words of Prosecutor Greg Davis's closing statements. Quote, "You know she did it, and the defense keeps saying that I didn't show you why she did it, and I think I did. We have a pretty good snapshot look at what this woman's life was like back then. It was so desperate that on May 3rd, 1996, in this beautifully normal American home with no problems in it, this woman is contemplating ending her own life. You know it wasn't good there. You know the pressures were building up with the children. You know she was unhappy that she hadn't had a girl. She was unhappy with her weight and her appearance. And she's unhappy that she's not getting the attention from her husband that she wants to get. And she is unhappy about their financial situation." Unquote. In his final words, he described what the state believed happened that night in the Routier home in graphic and painstaking detail. After describing for the jury what the state believed Darlie had done, he took aim and fired his most direct shot, telling the jury that she was the one who was responsible for everything that happened to Devin and Damon Routier that morning. And after 45 minutes of listening to his onslaught against her, Darlie broke in an uncontrolled outburst, shouting back, "Liar! You are a liar! I did not end the lives of my children." And with that outburst, Prosecutor Davis had won. He had succeeded in ringing a bell that could not be unrung. It was then that he looked at the jury, having shown them her anger in a way that no amount of evidence could. And in that moment, he achieved everything he could have wanted in the prosecution of Darlie Lynn Routier, the hearts and minds of the jury. This was one of the very last things I read in the trial record of Darlie's case. And I can still remember when I read this interaction between Darlie and Prosecutor Davis. It made sense to me in that moment why so many people who have studied the details surrounding this case hear the evidence that we just covered and are absolutely convinced of Darlie's guilt. It does. It makes sense why so many people believe that there is no need to go beyond this, because the case the state brought against Darlie at trial seems truly indefensible. In fact, you won't find any large true crime creators on this platform who have covered her case that will even attempt to comprehensively discuss the claims of her innocence. But I wanted to go there. I needed to go behind this criminal's mind so that I could see for myself what, if anything, I would find. Because when I started this, I, like so many of you, believed that she was guilty. But I also had nearly 30 years of legal experience that had taught me to never assume what I know until I fairly evaluate the entirety of any defendant's case from the perspective of the governing rules of criminal procedure, the case law, and all of the available evidence. And it's precisely because of that experience that I learned about the abundance of cases where people who were once found guilty beyond any reasonable doubt were then later determined to be innocent after the discovery of new evidence. People who were once condemned, convicted, and sentenced to death row by the justice system only later to find that they were telling the truth all along. It taught me to find the highest degree of certainty in a case before I make my own determination of guilt or innocence. So now that we have evaluated the evidence brought forth by the state, we will now review the defense of Darlie Routier. One of the most inescapable realities for any criminal defense attorney in a high-profile criminal trial is the unavoidable impact of the public's perception in a highly media-saturated case. This problem is often compounded when that defendant has already received widespread negative media attention, and as a consequence, the public's opinion now leans heavily towards their guilt. It is one of the main reasons why juries are regularly instructed by the presiding judge on the laws that govern their decisions, specifically their inherent biases, and the importance of their objectivity. However, even with these instructions and rules, it is not uncommon to find that jurors will subvert the governing guidelines upon them and allow their biases to dictate how they will ultimately rule.
Orenthal James Simpson, not guilty of the crime of murder in violation of Penal Code Section 187A, a felony upon Nicole Brown Simpson, a human being, as charged in count 1 of the information.
Over the years, we have become more aware of the impact that the media and public perception can have in a criminal action, simply by virtue of the sheer number of people who have been exonerated and found to have been innocent of the crimes for which they were previously convicted. Since 1973, at least 190 people have been exonerated from death row due to newfound evidence, advancements in forensics, and the discovery of new technologies that have led to scientific breakthroughs like DNA. 190 people who were placed on death row for a crime they did not commit is an absolutely staggering number. And yet within the capital punishment system of our country, there is a far darker reality, an ominous truth that is inextricably linked to those exonerations in a way that for me is simply impossible to reconcile. In 2021, lawyers from the Innocence Project went public with a story that did not receive the press or attention that it deserved. For 22 years, Liddell Lee maintained his innocence, a man who had been convicted of first-degree homicide and was now in his final days on death row. His lawyers had done everything in their power to petition the court to conduct testing on the primary evidence that led to his conviction, evidence that had never been DNA tested. But the state and judicial authorities refused his appeals, claiming that it was merely a stall tactic, and as the final seconds ran off the clock, Liddell Lee's death warrant was signed, and the state ended his life. Normally, that is where these cases end. People don't usually advocate for convicted felons who have already been executed by the state, but his family and lawyers from both the ACLU and the Innocence Project refused to give up. But their request for testing of the murder weapon was eventually granted, and what that testing revealed was and is completely devastating. The DNA taken from the murder weapon did not belong to Liddell Lee. Evidence that was never tested that could have proved his innocence definitively showed that the state had executed the wrong man, an innocent man. And that for the 22 years that Liddell Lee insisted that he was innocent, that in fact, he had been telling the truth all along. The day before his execution, he spoke with the BBC in an interview. He expressed his exasperation with what he had been forced to endure, liking it to the Twilight Zone. And most tragic of all was that even though he knew what he was about to face, his deepest concern in that moment wasn't himself, but rather his family and the pain that he knew that they would suffer because of a crime that he did not commit. But of all the tragedy that came from this case, it was his final words to the BBC that will stay with me for many years to come. He said, "My dying words will always be, as it has been, I am an innocent man." The tragic case of Liddell Lee helped to reveal an unimaginable reality that defendants standing trial are far too often believed to be guilty until proven innocent. Many, including the jury, often assume that they wouldn't be there standing trial if they hadn't done something to merit the charges in the first place. And once someone is believed to be guilty, especially after a conviction, then the criminal justice system, the appellate courts, and the general public tend to dismiss claims of unfairness. We tend to ignore the assertions that mistakes were made by law enforcement at trial or by overzealous prosecutors. And far too often, we as a whole err on the side that the system must have gotten it right. And as a consequence, we simply throw away the key. But even a defendant as heinous as Charles Manson, if they are not afforded a proper defense at trial, then as a consequence of that failure to adequately defend even the likes of him, then those mistakes open up a Pandora's box of appeals and delays that last for decades. So even if you're of the opinion that the person standing trial is a vile, odious, and despicable monster who does not deserve to breathe air, you want that person to have the most competent and thorough representation possible, precisely because of the fact that a failure to do so will virtually guarantee that their case will remain stuck in the appeals process for the entirety of their natural life. But that's the thing about capital murder cases that involve the death penalty. There are no do-overs once the death warrant has been signed and carried out. There is no opportunity to go back, to apologize, and to get it right. And it's for that very reason that I went into my assessment of Darlie's innocence open-minded, willing to critically evaluate each of the claims of her innocence on their merits and without my own personal bias. And my hope is that as I take you through her defense, you'll understand exactly why I believe that there is more to this case than what was brought forth at trial. So without further ado, this is the defense of Darlie Routier. One of the very first things I learned as a junior law clerk at my very first law firm was the overwhelming importance of a comprehensive understanding of your client's case and ensuring that you have all the time needed in order to be amply prepared for trial. Over the years, I would learn many important tools in an effective and competent lawyer's arsenal that would provide every client with the best possible chance at a successful outcome. But as anyone who has ever worked in the legal community knows, there are vitally important things that you should do in the defense of your client, and equally important things that you should not do. One of the first and most glaring problems that I noticed in Darlie Routier's case was the overwhelming evidence that her defense team failed in spectacular fashion to provide the representation expected of counsel defending their client against the death penalty. But in order to properly understand these issues, we need to evaluate each of the critical mistakes that were made in Darlie's defense. In the days following Darlie's arrest, the court would assign public defender attorney Douglas Parks to represent Darlie in her upcoming jury trial. Over the course of the next 4 months, attorney Parks would proceed with the preparation of his client's case. But in early October, he would discover that Darlie's family were in the final stages of firing him, choosing instead to replace him with the exceedingly more popular and well-known criminal defense attorney, Douglas Mulder. Attorney Mulder was a very well-respected criminal defense lawyer known throughout the entire state of Texas. Early in his career, he became a prosecutor whose tenacious nature would earn him the nickname Mad Dog Mulder, and his conviction rate was so high that he would send 24 people to death row in his time at the district attorney's office. But eventually, he would switch sides and would go on to represent some of the most widely publicized criminal cases throughout the entire state of Texas. By the time that Attorney Mulder would take the lead in Darlie's case, he was already down to the wire. Now, it cannot be overstated just how considerable of a problem he would have with only 9 weeks to prepare for the month-long jury trial. In fact, over the last few months, I have consulted with former colleagues who are still practicing criminal defense litigation, many of whom are some of the best litigators in their field, men and women who have defended people facing similar charges. And all of them have agreed unanimously that 9 weeks for a capital murder case of this magnitude is not only insufficient, but would virtually guarantee an inadequate defense for any client, let alone the already despised and reviled defendant of Rowlett, Texas, Darlie Routier. Most experienced criminal defense lawyers often require no less than 18 months to adequately prepare for a jury trial in a case of this size and scope. 9 weeks is absolutely unthinkable, and his lack of preparation was about to become glaringly apparent. After reviewing the totality of pleadings filed in Darlie's case, I cannot locate anywhere in the court record where her defense attorneys requested additional time to prepare for trial and to ensure his client received a rigorous defense. And this brings me to an important point that I need to address before we go any further. There is a real and seemingly unavoidable temptation whenever we hear of a criminal defense lawyer failing in their duties, especially when it's tied to a criminal case where the general public already largely believes the defendant to be guilty. We tend as a whole to blame the person standing trial and ignore claims of ineffective assistance of counsel. The unfortunate reality for most people is that whether you are charged with a minor misdemeanor or capital murder, your future largely depends on whether or not your attorney does their job. Attorneys who often have massive caseloads and have limited bandwidth to comprehend, retain, and prepare for a case as massive as Darlie Routier's. It has been my experience that the general public and appellate courts tend to punish the person who is charged for the mistakes of their attorney, a pervasive view that can be seen throughout the entirety of the justice system. Far too often, the uneducated person standing trial who never went to law school and has no formal training in the law is somehow responsible for the failures of their own attorney. Simply put, you would think if you hired a lawyer who cost you $90,000 that you would be in good hands. But the sad reality is, not necessarily. In fact, I have seen many prosecutors take advantage of these missteps and failures by new or overworked defense attorneys, or in Darlie's case, a wildly overconfident yet experienced lawyer who failed at one of the most fundamental and foundational aspects of a competent criminal defense attorney: rigorous preparation and sufficient time. By October of 1996, public defender Attorney Parks had learned of his replacement by Darlie's newfangled and flashy defense lawyer, and he was still very much aware of the fact that trial was looming mere weeks away. Attorney Parks had already retained two well-respected and experienced forensic experts, Terry Labor and Bart Epstein, to counter the state's evidence against Darlie at trial, experts who had already conducted tests that supported Darlie's claims of an intruder. Terry Labor would later provide an affidavit in connection to Darlie's appeals that would confirm the testing they had conducted and what it had revealed. The following is just one of the important claims made in Labor's affidavit to the appellate court. Quote, "Based on the analysis that I performed on this case, it is my professional opinion today that there were numerous pieces of physical evidence we reviewed that were not consistent with a staged crime scene." Unquote. In that same affidavit, he offered specific examples of the tests that they had conducted prior to Attorney Mulder's involvement. Tests that countered the state's experts that had testified against Darlie during her lengthy trial. And these experts had found the following. 1. An initial assessment of the vacuum cleaner showed that it had not been pushed around by someone who was bleeding, but instead, the bleeding occurred once the vacuum had already been knocked down. 2. An examination of shards of broken glass indicated that the wine glass that had been broken was not consistent with a staged crime scene, because it appeared as though the glass had been broken while still in the wine rack. This did not match the theory that Darlie had purposefully broken the glass to make it appear as though an intruder had entered the home. Additionally, one of the most important statements made by Labor in his affidavit spoke to the very heart of the state's entire forensic case that was critical in securing Darlie's conviction. It read as follows: "In my professional opinion, scientific testing of the physical evidence would have been critical to Darlie Lynn Routier's defense. Independent testing of that physical evidence was crucial to properly evaluate the state's case. There were numerous potential holes in the state's case that required testing to conform or refute the state's presentation of the evidence and to provide evidence that could have well refuted the state's forensic testimony." The statements that expert Terry Labor just made are incredibly important to understand. One of the most common misconceptions that I routinely dealt with in my career was having to explain to clients the difference between a primary care physician that treats their regular healthcare needs and an expert that has been hired to evaluate them either by the state or by an adverse party. For several years, I helped support my law firm's workers' compensation division, and during that time, I worked on many hundreds of cases. And without fail, no matter how severe our clients' injuries were, the moment they met with a physician who was hired by the insurance company to testify against them, that physician would always find that our client was somehow perfectly healthy and fully functional, somehow able to return to work with limited or no restrictions. This would even happen to clients who had suffered catastrophic injuries that they had sustained on the job, many who were still in wheelchairs or even bedridden, and in extreme cases, completely disabled. Despite a mountain of records, countless surgeons, treating providers, and other supporting evidence, somehow the insurance company's doctor would always find that our clients were now fully able to return to their construction or manual labor jobs. All that to say that it has been my experience that no matter how clear a case may seem, you will likely find an expert willing to testify against that case for a fee. In fact, there are experts who will only testify for one side or the other, and that kind of expert shopping runs rampant throughout the entirety of the American judicial system. And it's precisely because of that problem within our courts that you often have to look at the veracity of the experts' testing methods. And in Terry Labor's affidavit, he explains that a very real problem existed within the state's evidence. The fact being that independent, material, and compositional testing was not conducted to verify the state's primary evidence, testing that has increasingly become the accepted standard to ensure a scientific certainty of any expert's findings, most especially for cases involving the death penalty. Now, you might be wondering, like I was, why Terry Labor's affidavit came after Darlie's trial and not during. Well, strap in, because the answer is both shocking and, for me, nearly impossible to believe or even comprehend. After the state had shown the jury all of their forensic evidence, who do you think Attorney Douglas Mulder, the high-priced, big-shot defense lawyer, put in the witness stand to counter any of the state's experts' claims? Because I would assume that it would be some other high-priced expert who specialized in these kinds of difficult and complex capital murder cases. Or maybe even someone who had testified in other media frenzy trials that had years of forensic experience, who then refuted the claims made by the state using the breadth of their experience to clearly establish reasonable doubt. Because surely Attorney Mulder, knowing that his client is facing the death penalty, would have hired the foremost experts in the state to ensure the best possible representation for his client. I mean, right? Because that is the bare minimum expectation in a case of this magnitude, and anyone who has ever spent a modicum of time as a trial attorney knows that you cannot allow the state's expert to testify in front of the jury unanswered. Most especially when you consider that there were already 2 previous experts hired by Darlie's former public defender that had already started their own testing and had found evidence in support of Darlie's claims of an intruder. Because it would be absolutely absurd for a lawyer of Attorney Mulder's caliber going Mach 10 into one of the most highly contentious jury trials the city of Rowlett had ever seen, with only 9 weeks to prepare, to then not even bother to hire any expert to defend the very life of his client that had just shelled out $90,000 to literally save her life. I mean, right? He wouldn't do that, would he? Well, I'm sure by now you realize that is precisely what Attorney Douglas Mulder did. He allowed the state to present their forensic evidence without so much as a peep from any defense expert whatsoever. And I simply cannot stress enough the unmitigated failure that was and is to any client, regardless of how you may feel about them. And here's the thing, that isn't even the worst part of Attorney Mulder's failure as Darlie's representative in a trial involving life or death. So hold on, because it's about to get much worse. In the months prior to being fired by the Routiers, Public Defender Parks had already developed a theory that involved Darlie's husband Darren as the perpetrator of the crime. Now, this is a very common tactic in any criminal defense case, but even more so in the case of Darlie Routier, because the allegation had teeth as well as evidence to support it. Most especially when you consider that years after the trial, Darren would produce an affidavit wherein he would admit that he had been telling virtually everyone he knew about his financial woes. He would admit that he had even approached several people to ask them to come to his house and stage a robbery for the purposes of collecting insurance money. Not to mention the fact that Darren had a life insurance policy on Darlie worth $250,000. Let me say that just one more time. The policy that was on the life of Darlie Lynn Routier, a policy that would have been payable to her husband Darren, was worth $250,000. And that information is compounded by the fact that Darren had spent much of the preceding months prior to the attacks telling everyone and anyone to come to his house and effectively stage a home invasion. Now, Attorney Parks was not aware of this information in the beginning of his work on Darlie's case, but he knew what every good defense attorney understands, that he had to give the jury evidence that supported reasonable doubt, that he had to give them an alternative, someone other than his own client. So when Attorney Parks learned that his replacement was not at all interested in involving Darren in the crime, he was completely dumbfounded. Now, it goes without saying that most attorneys who have just been fired, especially overworked public defenders, would simply cut their losses and move on. But Attorney Parks was not most attorneys. In fact, the decision by Attorney Mulder to not involve Darren in Darlie's defense was so concerning to him that he wrote Attorney Mulder a letter directly expressing his concerns. But his efforts would ultimately fall on deaf ears, as Darlie's new attorney would respond to his concerns by saying that he did not believe Darren had any involvement in the crime, and in the same breath admitted that he had not reviewed any of the evidence against Darren from the public defender's office. But the real motivations for his refusal to involve Darren was about to come into focus. Since Darlie's trial, it has been revealed that attorney Douglas Mulder was hired by Darren and Darlie Routier in connection with a show cause hearing where the state alleged that both had violated the gag order concerning discussions with the media, a violation that could have potentially landed Darren in jail. According to court records, attorney Douglas Mulder had heard of the public defender's intent to implicate Darren in the crime as part of Darlie's defense. But in what can only be described as an underhanded and unethical maneuver, attorney Mulder told Darren of the plan to blame him, but promised him that if he was hired to represent Darlie, that he would not argue to implicate him in any way. And to absolutely no one's surprise, that same day, Darlie fired her public defender, and attorney Douglas Mulder became her lead counsel with only 9 weeks to spare before her trial would commence. Attorney Parks' concerns fell on deaf ears, and Darlie's future was now firmly in the hands of a man representing the interests of both her and her husband. But public defender Parks was not the only one troubled by the obvious conflict of interest. The state had also become seriously concerned, and on November 12, 1996, the prosecutor's office filed a notice of possible conflict of interest into the judicial record. I simply cannot stress enough how uncommon and unusual it is for the prosecutor's office to involve themselves in the technical blunders of a defense lawyer seemingly riding afoul of the rules and ethics that govern all practicing attorneys. And yet somehow the state was more concerned about protecting Darlie's Sixth Amendment rights to conflict-free counsel than her own attorney was. But it's what the state said in their filing with the court that I found very interesting. At this moment in time, still weeks before the commencement of Darlie's trial, even the state believed that Darren had been involved in the crime, and they said as much in their filing. It read as follows: investigations are ongoing with regards to the analysis of physical evidence, and recent analysis of the physical evidence suggests that Darren Routier may have participated. And if that wasn't bad enough, Attorney Mulder had all of the following evidence available to him. 1, he knew that Darren's hair had been found on the murder weapon found at the crime scene. 2, he had evidence that showed law enforcement had found the blood-stained sock in the alley that contained fibers from Darren's blood-stained sneakers. 3, he was also aware of Darren's inconsistent statements concerning his blood-stained jeans. 4, he knew that blood was also found on Darren's underwear. And 5, Attorney Mulder was completely aware of Darren's inconsistent statements and suspicious behavior that occurred at the crime scene and at the hospital. So now, after both sides had expressed their concerns to the court and to Attorney Mulder concerning his wildly inappropriate conflicts of interest and his promise to Darren to not accuse him despite all of the credible and forensic evidence, what do you imagine his response to the state's court filing was? Because I'd be willing to bet my oceanfront property in Arizona that you probably wouldn't guess that after the innumerable reasons he had to include Darren in Darlie's defense, he simply didn't say anything at all. But even more disconcerting than all of that evidence that was known or should have been known to Attorney Mulder was the fact that Darren himself would later admit in a sworn affidavit that in the spring of 1996, he had spoken with Darlie's stepfather. And in that conversation, he asked him, quote, if he knew of anyone who would agree to burglarize his home as part of an insurance scam, unquote. In Darren's own sworn affidavit, he also stated that, quote, he and his family would be gone from the house and that the burglar would come to the house with a U-Haul truck and remove gobs of stuff from the house, which he would then retrieve after the insurance company paid off. And that this wasn't the only time that Darren had hatched similar schemes. 2 years prior, he had arranged to have his Jaguar stolen to collect the insurance money, and said that that crime went off without a hitch. This was more than a simple misstep by an overconfident defense attorney who had engaged in wildly unethical and inappropriate behavior between two clients with competing interests. This was a monumental failure to aggressively and competently defend his client, who at that moment in time was facing being executed on death row. And by the time all of these facts would reach the appellate court in the form of Darlie's habeas petition, it was far too little, way too late. There is often a massive chasm between what the general public believes should happen to a person standing trial and what the law actually allows. This is best demonstrated in the explosive media attention surrounding the Bryan Kohberger case. Despite the fact that very little empirical evidence has been made available to the public, you don't have to go very far to find media outlets, true crime content creators, podcasters, and the like who have already deemed him guilty and who have already begun discussing what his likely punishment will be at sentencing. Now, I want to be clear, Bryan Kohberger may end up being found guilty, and he very well may have been responsible for the heinous crimes that were committed against those 4 innocent people. But we cannot allow the justice system to become an echo chamber of assumed guilt. Unfortunately, this very same issue of guilty until proven innocent seemed to haunt the case of Darlie Routier from the very beginning. And this assumption of guilt was demonstrated in virtually every aspect of the case that the state brought against Darlie, but more specifically, how the state portrayed her character to the jury. Sadly, most people do not know that when you are a criminal defendant, there are very specific rules that prosecutors must follow, specific to their claims and discussions of your character. One of the most fundamental elements of those guidelines precisely speaks to how criminal actions are to be conducted in front of a jury, and specifically states the following: that a defendant's bad character cannot be used to argue that the defendant committed the crime for which he or she is being tried, or that they had the propensity to commit the crime. Further noting that a prosecutor who dwells on a defendant's alleged bad character in this prohibited manner may be found to have engaged in prosecutorial misconduct. Simply put, a defendant must be tried on the facts of the case stemming from the crime itself, not on claims made by prosecutors concerning their assumed guilt due to allegations of their faulty or problematic character. So I began to dig through the statements made by the prosecutors during Darlie's trial, and I didn't have to look far to find the first of many clear violations of these important guidelines. Because legally speaking, what I found in the pages of these court transcripts is completely unbelievable. These are the words of Prosecutor Greg Davis, spoken to the jury about defendant Darlie Routier. The evidence will show you that the real Darlie Routier is in fact a self-centered woman, a materialistic woman, a woman cold enough, in fact, to murder her own 2 children. And we sat through 4.5 weeks seeing the evil displayed before us, and today that evil goes by the name of Darlie Lynn Routier. She sits here crying before you as she did on Saturday. We know what she's all about at this point of the trial, don't we? She is not like us. Don't get into that game about she is like me. She ain't. There's just no way that she is. We do know that at times we are dealing with the principalities of evil in this world. And a delegate sits among us right now of that evil, and her name is Darlie Lynn Routier. When I first read those words, I almost couldn't believe that they were spoken by any lawyer, let alone a prosecutor, inside of a courtroom during trial in front of an actual jury. Because even if the person that those words were spoken to was someone who had already admitted to committing this crime, the fact of the matter is they fly in the face of everything that our judicial system is founded upon. The rules that I quite literally just read prohibit this exact kind of behavior. Now, I understand that we may not like that, but there is an expectation that if you are standing trial for a capital offense, facing life or death, that the religion of the jury cannot be weaponized against you, while a prosecutor places into the minds of that jury that you are a literal delegate of evil. And even if the words of Prosecutor Davis had been spoken concerning the likes of Charles Manson or Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer, I would be equally as impassioned in my response, predicated on the foundation that they are the definition of an unethical and willful violation of the rules of ethics and criminal procedure that governs all lawyers, irrespective of how we may feel about the person standing trial. And it is precisely for this reason why our courts do not allow these kinds of character attacks from prosecutors. It's very simple. Prosecutors and all practicing lawyers are held to a higher standard. And the thing is, Attorney Greg Davis did exactly this kind of thing throughout the entirety of Darlie's trial, asking Darlie when she testified if she regularly took her children to church. What in the world does that have anything to do with the crime that she was accused of, other than to establish in the minds of this wildly conservative jury, firmly in the middle of the Bible Belt, that she is not a good, God-fearing, church-going woman who clearly lacks moral fortitude and by extension must have been responsible for this crime? That is not evidence. And whether we like it or not, prosecutors are strictly prohibited from this kind of characterization of any defendant, regardless of what the general public thinks of that person. And never mind the fact that he regularly spoke about her being overweight, repeatedly brought up her breast augmentation as well as the cost of it, then brought on non-medical experts to testify that she did not grieve correctly, then had people tell the jury about the times that she was a questionable or even abusive mother, excessively disciplining her children with shouting and curse words, and even putting a piece of cake in her own son's face when he squirted her with water. All of which are the epitome of what the previous rules state a prosecutor cannot do. And even if we believe these issues are relevant as a society, the law states that a defendant must be prosecuted and found guilty on the evidence stemming from the crime. Because again, prosecutors and criminal defense attorneys are held to a higher standard than the general public. And that isn't simply my opinion or how I feel. It is a fact and a governing rule upon which the entirety of the criminal justice system stands. But time and time again, Prosecutor Greg Davis attacked Darlie's character in front of the media, at press conferences, in interviews, and virtually every single chance he has ever had to speak about her case. But even worse than the clear and obvious signs of Prosecutor Davis's attempts to prejudice the jury against his defendant was the unforgivable sin of Darlie's criminal defense attorney, Douglas Mulder, failing time after time to object and realign the train that was barreling towards his client. But even after evaluating the sum total of her defense team's failures to adequately defend her at trial, I recognized that there was still insufficient evidence to demonstrate indisputable reasonable doubt. Speaking strictly from a legal standpoint, these issues satisfied the requirements needed to have granted Darlie a new trial, and yet sadly the appellate court completely disregarded the litany of evidence that proved her defense attorney failed in his duties to provide effective representation at trial. But even with these egregious missteps by her defense attorney and the state, I realized that they were still inadequate in providing a reasonable explanation for what transpired on June 6, 1996. But just as I was getting ready to throw in the towel after countless hours of investigation, I came across evidence that would radically change how I viewed Darlie Routier's case. Evidence that forever altered how I see capital punishment throughout the entirety of the American criminal justice system. After many weeks of studying the case against Darlie, reading through the trial records, and devouring every form of public media available covering her trial, I came to the realization that at the center of her defense was a Mount Everest-sized problem that simply could not be traversed or ignored. Even as I began reading through the claims of her innocence, it always remained in the back of my mind, reminding me that it was there, and that it would have to be overcome before I could accept the notion of reasonable doubt. At its base was Darlie and the fact that she had claimed to be asleep that night, and at its summit was a seemingly impossible problem to overcome. It was the stark reality that in order to accept that her story was true, she somehow slept through the brutal crime committed against her children who were mere feet away. It didn't make sense, and the various defense claims of ether or chloroform being administered by an intruder were not based in the physical evidence. And no matter what I found in her defense, they could not rectify this Everest-sized problem for me. I would eventually come to the conclusion that I would have to relent and admit that no matter how much evidence existed in her defense concerning failures by her attorneys or counter evidence to the state's case, that this was a mountain that I simply could not climb. When I came to this realization, I remember that I finished reading for the day and began autoplaying old video clips from the 90s that had covered Darlie's trial. It would eventually land on an old episode of the daytime talk show, The Lisa Gibbons Show. In that episode, members of the Routier family, a juror from the trial, and other participants had been invited as a panel to discuss Darlie's case. Most of the recording was evidence that I had already heard, and yet some of it was very revealing. In one of the more interesting segments, a juror from Darlie's trial spoke about Darlie directly.
She didn't. Absolutely not. Okay. Absolutely
she
not.
She did not.
There were
feet
Nobody ever said she away from her head. Feet. That's all. Just feet
inches.
Away from her head.
Inches. Say
okay.
Inches.
Tell you
wrong.
That if my children were feet away from my head, the first child may have gotten stabbed, but the second one he wouldn't have gotten near without getting through me.
Well,
now.
I couldn't help but notice how she spoke about her with such a seething hatred unlike anything I had seen in recent history. It was obvious to me how much of an impact the prosecution's statements concerning Darlie's character had on the jurors. But as the episode went on, the panel became more contentious and quickly devolved into a Jerry Springer-like chaos. And just as quickly, I stood up to turn it off. But before I could, I overheard Darlie Routier say something that caused me to literally stop in stunned disbelief.
You guys said that she didn't have any problems, like mental problems or anything, but then you said that she was taking medication.
After the boys died.
Before she was taking diet pills.
Yes. Fen-Phen.
At that point of my investigation, I had read a considerable part of the trial record, but I had not yet completed it, and until that moment, I was not aware of something critical that the former mother-in-law of Darlie Routier had just said. It was one of the only moments in my entire life that I can recall having a literal flashback to one of the most formidable periods of my legal career. In a flash, memories from that time of my life flooded back into focus. Nearly a decade of my career where I had been recruited for one singular litigation wherein my law firm would represent nearly 30,000 clients across the entire United States that to that point would become the single largest mass tort litigation in American history. I began to remember the countless clients I had met with face to face, people who I would get to know personally over the course of nearly 8 years, learning every aspect of their lives and how they had been affected. It brought me back to the thousands of clients that I would speak with on the phone, meet with in person, logging hundreds of thousands of hours into their individual case files. People who would become more than just a number, but very much like family, regularly calling to provide important updates about their lives, their daily struggles, and most importantly, all of the side effects and the injuries they had sustained. Now, I am not intentionally being vague for the sake of suspense. On the contrary, from the moment I realized what I had just come across in Darlie's case, I also realized that it would be virtually impossible to explain the history that I had experienced for such a large part of my life without the weight of that lived experience behind it. I realized that in order for me to properly explain to you why this directly impacts Darlie's case, I would need to show you that evidence from my own vantage point. Because if I hadn't lived it, I don't know if I would have believed it. But rest assured, by the time I'm done, it's my hope that you will understand exactly why I believe that this information is vital to understanding the arrest, the trial, and the conviction of Darlie Lynn Routier. I still remember where I was when I got the news that the litigation had finally ended and that we had reached a record-breaking settlement for our clients. For most of the preceding 8 years, our clients had suffered in silence as our law firm pursued a painstaking litigation against the makers of the now banned diet pill, fenfluramine, and its counterpart, dexfenfluramine, more popularly known as Fen-Phen. The settlement was unprecedented, and while it would guarantee some form of justice for the horrific crime that had been perpetrated against the unsuspecting American public, I couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness, a feeling of despondency, because while we were settling their cases for the injuries covered by the litigation, there were countless clients who believed that there were additional injuries that they had sustained in connection to the diet pills, injuries that were unable to be included in the litigation. Fen-Phen was pulled off the market on September 15, 1997, largely due to the overwhelming evidence that showed damage to the heart valves and lungs of its users. The FDA's ban of the drug would eventually result in a subsequent nationwide action against the makers of the diet drug, specifically for users who had sustained injuries primarily to their heart valves, but also included authority to cover their lung and respiratory injuries to those who had sustained them. But in order to qualify for the settlement, clients would have to undergo an ultrasound of their heart in order to establish the degree of damage they had suffered from taking the diet pills. This requirement would pose a very serious problem for our law firm, mostly because our clients could not afford the cost of an echocardiogram that was not deemed medically necessary by their health insurance, and many of our clients did not have health insurance to speak of. So we quickly devised a plan to go around the woes of the American healthcare system, and instead we hired an ultrasound company who would conduct these tests for us and on behalf of our clients. This required us to test every single one of our clients in almost every single state across the country over the course of several years, and it was a task that I and a few other legal representatives in my firm were tasked to complete. In addition, we would conduct in-person depositions that would allow us to gain a deeper understanding of our clients' medical history and to preserve their rights for any future settlements that they were entitled to. Over the next few years, I would eventually travel to nearly every state in the union, meeting with hundreds and eventually thousands of clients in person. And it was during those in-person meetings that I first began to notice a reoccurring problem. By the time our clients came to us to have their echocardiogram conducted, they were already well aware that we would be pursuing their case on the basis of the injuries they had sustained to their heart or lungs. But from my very first trip, I would be confronted by an entirely unexpected set of problems. Clients began continuously telling me about the neurological problems that they were having from taking the diet pills. From the very first day, I began hearing clients complain of short-term memory loss, depression, drastic sleep pattern changes, and other neurological issues that were not the basis for our representation. Over and over, I would sadly be forced to explain to each person that while these issues were horrible, that we were not able to pursue them as part of our case against the makers of Fen-Phen. I wouldn't learn until much later that the reason we weren't pursuing it was because the drug makers had intentionally never published the neurological effects on humans in their clinical trials. And this was despite the fact that other studies had already demonstrated neurological damage from the drug. Towards the end of the litigation, we discovered that the pharmaceutical companies who had made Fen-Phen appeared to intentionally avoid financially supporting any of the studies on the human brain precisely because they already knew their drug to be neurotoxic, and much of this information was not made public due to non-disclosure agreements arising from the eventual settlements. But for nearly 8 years of my career, I was the primary contact for thousands of clients who would call in periodically to provide medical updates, and the number of times that I heard each of them tell me about how they were affected neurologically was simply staggering. People who would sometimes scream and yell in frustration, furious that we were unable to sue the makers of the diet drug because of their inability to function normally. These conversations happened so frequently that the managing partners of my law firm began sending letters explaining to each client that we were unable to pursue cases on the basis of neurological damage alone, a decision that I never supported but was entirely out of my hands. In 2003, I met a young woman in her late 20s in Grand Rapids, Michigan during one of my trips to conduct client echocardiograms. And the story she told me that day is one that I will truly never forget. She had been in her final year of her master's degree program when she decided to start taking Fen-Phen to help lose the weight that she had gained during her previous year of schooling. She sat there in tears as she explained how she wasn't the same anymore, how despite being at the top of her class in high school and her undergrad, always maintaining a 4.0, that after she took Fen-Phen, she had failed out of every class in her program because, as she said, I just couldn't retain anything anymore. We talked for an hour that day, 59 minutes of which was about the neurological and short-term memory problems that she had suffered. And less than a week later, when I called her to provide her the results of her ultrasound, She barely remembered speaking with me just days before. Completely unable to recall any of the details we had spoke about that day, she took the diet drug Fen-Phen for just 45 days. During the many years of our litigation, we learned that fenfluramine and dexfenfluramine was linked to neurotoxicity, a primary symptom of which is short-term memory loss. The evidence of the catastrophic neurological damage due to Fen-Phen is not a widely reported symptom of the drug. But when I heard Darlie Routier tell the audience that Darlie had been on Fen-Phen for months prior to the night of June 6th, after those words left her mouth, for me, everything came into focus. I feverishly went back through the records and the entirety of Darlie's case, and it became a puzzle piece that now began to match areas of her case that had previously never made any sense. I now realized the full weight of Attorney Douglas Mulder's failure at Darlie's trial because all of this information was available to him at that time. Information that could have provided a reasonable explanation for some of the most challenging and previously damning elements of Darlie's case. And so I revisited many of the hallmarks of the prosecution's case against Darlie from the vantage point of the one thing Darlie never had at trial: a competent criminal defense attorney and a rigorous defense. The question of how Darlie could have slept through the attacks of her children? Almost immediately, I remembered my client from Oklahoma who had called us after an F3 tornado had blown through her community to inform us that she was okay. A woman who had been in the military for 12 years, who had 3 children and was always the first to wake up at the sound of a pin dropping, had somehow slept through a tornado, nearly blowing her entire house down. She would become just one of the hundreds of people who told us similar experiences about their drastic sleep pattern changes after weeks of using the diet drug. I remember Darlie's changing stories and how they shifted or were amended as time went on. Again, I sat there recalling the countless times I would speak with our clients who would tell me something one day, call back days later, and say something entirely different. One day, they thought they had taken the drug for 3 weeks, and just days later they called, and now it's 6. It was one of the primary reasons we had to start requesting pharmacy records because of this reoccurring problem. It was then I remembered how the makers of Fen-Phen even acknowledged to the FDA that their drug interacted with our brain's serotonin system. I remembered how I learned about the serotonergic system during our litigation, a system which regulates the brain's ability to store and recall memories. And then I remembered how the state had used Darlie's journal entry as proof of her intent to end her life and the lives of her children. For me, that was one of the most profound moments of realization in the entirety of this investigation. Remembering how many times I spoke with clients on the phone who would call crying, pouring their hearts out, telling me that they had never had depression before taking Fen-Phen. People who at the beginning of taking the diet pills were for a time happy and full of joy, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, it was as though their ability to even experience happiness just went away. And all of these were a hallmark symptom of a serotonin deficiency, which was a common daily discussion with Fen-Phen clients from across the entirety of the United States of America. And now, with this knowledge in hand, a journal entry that once brought suspicion and the assumption of guilt now had an entirely different meaning. All of these memories began having a cascading effect because I remembered the innumerable times I would talk to clients as they would get further and further away from their use of the diet pills, and how their neurological systems over time would start to recover, and how memories that were once blurred and hazy would become more and more clear over time. I realized how something that had a physiological, neurological, and rational explanation in the medical world would instead have the appearance of deceitful and criminal behavior when viewed against the backdrop of a heinous crime. A vast majority of the clients we represented during the nearly decade-long litigation took the diet pills for between 4 and 8 weeks. Over time, we learned that the longer a client took the drug, the more likely they would sustain severe cardiac, respiratory, and neurological problems. We would represent clients that only took the drug for as little as 3 weeks, some who were in their early 20s, men and women who had otherwise been healthy, but were now facing a horrific diagnosis called primary pulmonary hypertension, a diagnosis that at the time was a death sentence, a disease that could only be cured with a dual heart and lung transplant. And many of the people who were diagnosed with that disease only took Fen-Phen for 3 to 4 weeks. Digging through Darlie's case records, I was stunned when I came across the documents that told me exactly how long she had been on this cardiac, respiratory, and neurotoxic pharmaceutical drug that would ravage the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. And when I saw it, I almost couldn't believe the words on the page. Darlie Routier had taken Fen-Phen for 4 months by the morning of June 6, 1996. So it was at that moment that I resolved to go back through the entirety of Darlie's case to see if there was evidence that could support her claims of innocence, firmly establishing reasonable doubt, and allow me to make that impossible climb up that mountain, and to finally answer the questions that I had started out with from the very beginning. Is Darlie Routier guilty beyond any reasonable doubt? And does she deserve to be on death row? And what I was about to find would allow me to answer those questions. By the time Darlie's defense was presented to the jury, it was evident to anyone watching that her team would need to put forward believable evidence to counter the litany of claims that had been presented by the prosecution. But as I read through the court transcripts, I was amazed at the consistent failures by her defense team to do exactly that. Usually, when you evaluate a case that has already gone through the trial process, you can very easily find the evidence that was presented from both the prosecution and the defense. And as we already know, this didn't happen in Darlie's trial in one of the most widely discussed areas by those who support her guilt, the forensic evidence. Due to this catastrophic error, the assumption tends to be that since evidence wasn't presented to the jury, it either didn't exist or wasn't credible. Well, thankfully, forensic experts Terry Laber and Bart Epstein have since provided the appellate court evidence that did support Darlie's claims, despite the fact that they were never allowed to finish their work. But let's evaluate the primary issues brought against Darlie at trial and see if, in fact, there are any signs of reasonable doubt. The prosecution's claim that Darlie's injuries were entirely superficial has to be one of the most widely repeated statements that I have heard from every single documentary I have ever seen in Darlie's case. In fact, it is repeated so often that by the time you arrive at the physical evidence of her injuries, you already believe that she had to have inflicted these injuries upon herself, and that despite the appearance of their severity, they were little more than a minor scratch that required a handful of stitches. But as usual, I didn't take those claims at face value, and what I found in the records was nothing short of unbelievable. One of the incredible breakthroughs of modern science over the last 50 years is how effective it is in painting a picture for us, a picture that we wouldn't otherwise have using our eyesight alone. So it was incredibly shocking to me when I looked at her medical records, and after all these years, sitting there in plain sight was proof positive that all of the claims about Darlie's superficial injuries are completely incorrect. The treating physician from Baylor Medical Center testified during Darlie's trial that her hemoglobin dropped by 2 grams in the hours following her hospitalization. Now, to the average layperson, that may seem like an entirely inconsequential fact. However, I assure you it is not. Because in order for your hemoglobin to drop by 2 grams, you would need to lose 2,000 cc's of blood. And courtesy of Darlie's shirt and the crime scene, we can see evidence that supports that very fact. Now, it may surprise you to know, but 2,000 cc's is nearly half of the blood that Darlie had in her body. So then the next logical question is, how much blood can a human body lose before we die from blood loss? And there it is, In black and white, an indisputable medical fact that disproves one of the primary claims made against Darlie since day one. All this time, we have been told time and time again that her injuries were always entirely insignificant and superficial, and that they were never at any point life-threatening. While everyone has spent decades arguing about the depth of the injury and the millimeters from her carotid sheath, no one bothered to pay any attention to the fact that she was quite literally on the brink of death. All this time, through every documentary, podcast, YouTube video, Forensic Files episode, and everyone who has claimed that Darlie's injuries were minor at best, every single one of them got it wrong. Now, you may be tempted to think that maybe the hemoglobin is somehow inconsequential. Well, I'll prove to you that it isn't. Because do you want to know what else we know? That night, Darlie was diagnosed with acute post-hemorrhagic anemia, which only happens in the body after you have lost a considerable, life-threatening amount of blood. Additionally, Darlie was in surgery for an entire hour, and I can tell you, as someone who has gone through 20 plus surgeries in my lifetime, superficial injuries do not take an entire hour to repair in surgery. But if all you had ever seen are the countless documentaries that have deemed Darlie guilty from the beginning, you might incorrectly believe that she barely suffered a scratch, a flesh wound. But while Officer Waddell testified in front of the jury, chastising Darlie for not providing aid to her children, something he himself was trained to do, the reality was that she was literally fighting for her life while applying pressure to her hemorrhaging wound on her neck, and the whole time she was literally on the verge of bleeding to death. And to those who claim that her blood pressure was normal when she got into the ambulance, that is less than meaningless, because the body does a strange thing when it's fighting for survival. It releases adrenaline to keep your heart pumping as a result of the loss of blood volume, as a means to keep you alive, which by extension temporarily raises your blood pressure. And while everyone has repeatedly blamed Darlie for not asking about her children, they all ignored the fact that she can clearly be heard on the 911 call over and over, repeatedly saying, "My babies are dead, my babies are dead," because in fact, they were. A woman who herself was in the process of losing nearly half of her blood volume, a woman with no medical training whatsoever, was blamed for not rendering aid to children who were already beyond saving. A fact that was confirmed at trial by the EMTs who arrived within minutes of her call, that Devin was already gone, and that by the time they put Damon into the back of the ambulance, he never once showed any signs of life, breathing, heartbeat, or otherwise, and both boys' injuries were severe enough that nothing anyone could have done, absent of an operating room in Darlie's kitchen, would have saved either child's life. And the fact is, plain and simple, that Darlie was severely injured and likely came within minutes of losing her own life that night. During the trial, Darlie's defense put on their own medical expert that testified that her injuries were consistent with an attack from an intruder, including defensive wounds to her arm and fingers. And in fact, there was evidence in the form of damage to the necklace she was wearing at the time that was consistent with her laying on her back at the moment she sustained the injuries to her neck. And there is also blood evidence on the couch that supports that she in fact bled while she was still laying down asleep. Sadly, one of the many things that wasn't properly addressed in Darlie's trial by the defense is the claim that there should have been more blood on the couch if in fact that was the location of the attack. But that is simply not how the human body works. When we sleep, our blood pressure and heart rates plummet, and it is not uncommon for some people to have resting heart rates that dip into the 30s and 40s. So it makes perfect sense that while she's still sleeping, she doesn't bleed excessively, precisely because of the fact that no major artery was severed by the intruder, which was her story from day one. And then, once she got up to take chase after the intruder, now that her blood pressure and heart rate have risen, that is when the blood loss increased exponentially. But easily, one of the most divisive parts of Darlie's case surrounds the bruising on her arms. The claim by the prosecution at trial is that Darlie must have self-inflicted the bruises after she left the hospital because no one from the medical staff seemed to recall ever seeing them during her hospitalization. But never mind the fact that Darlie's family testified that they did see the bruises on her arms while she was still in the hospital. But let's look at some of the only available pictures taken of Darlie while she was still hospitalized. Now, because of the incredibly poor quality of this picture, I have adjusted the brightness and nothing else. All this adjustment does is increase the colors in a spectrum that allows us to see her skin clearly, as it was, with more clarity. And now, because of that clarity, we can see all of the purple bruises that were under her arm before she ever left the hospital. Now, the claim by the prosecution and countless others is that the bruising was so much worse days later when Darlie arrived at the police station to take pictures. And by extension, this must have meant that they were all self-inflicted. But all this does is speak to the level of medical ignorance that is rampant throughout the entirety of this jury trial. But when bruising of this magnitude seen in this picture happens, it often continues to expand over time. But allow me to demonstrate. In these pictures of a totally random person taken from the internet, you can see a day-by-day view of how the bruising progresses from day 1 until day 14. And yet somehow, bruising that looked one way on day 1 progressively worsens multiple days later. So using the prosecutor's same line of thinking, that must mean that this woman who had a nose job must have gone home and had her significant other hit her in the face with a baseball bat. Because as you can see, her bruising continues to worsen somehow, despite no signs of the bruising in those areas days before. You know, I think we must have some kind of conspiracy happening of people being viciously assaulted shortly after their cosmetic surgery. Someone needs to contact the FBI. We have a serial attacker on our hands. Are you seeing how absurd this is now, or should I keep going? Because the fact of the matter is, when dealing with traumatic subcutaneous bruising and injuries of this magnitude, the human body demonstrates a healing process with a very similar progressive pattern. So when you take those facts into consideration, then the bruising on Darlie's arm was consistent with having been inflicted in the early morning of June 6, 1996. Because as we can plainly see in this picture, the bruising was already there long before she ever left the hospital and was allowed the opportunity to inflict those injuries on herself. And I'll be honest with you, the fact that I haven't heard any of these things in any of the major documentaries I've seen is nothing short of infuriating to me. Especially because so many of these things are simple medical science, things that the defense should have known, and most importantly, the state should have known. But this is not the first time in my career where I've come across cases where a prosecutor made claims about things that they knew nothing about, and then the world runs off on a tangent with that misinformation, and before you know it, someone's life is completely ruined. But I knew that I had to continue to do my very best to maintain my own personal objectivity throughout the entirety of my evaluation. So at this moment in time, I hadn't come to any conclusions about the evidence yet. But what I had concluded is that the claim that she was only superficially wounded is medically and factually incorrect, and that is supported by the evidence. However, I continued to press onward up the mountain and to allow that evidence to continue to guide me. From the opening statements made by the prosecution, they would tell the jury, the media, and anyone who would listen that Darlie was a vain, materialistic, wealth-obsessed, and abusive mother who was determined to get money at any cost, even to the point of taking her own children's lives. And it's important to remember that this claim is the state's primary argument for Darlie's motive to commit this crime. But let's really look at the state's claim concerning the alleged financial problems that the Routiers were supposedly in. 1 year before the crime, in 1995, Darren Routier made $264,000, which adjusted for inflation would be the equivalent of making $506,952.76 in today's money. Now, the claim by the prosecution was that he had experienced a downturn in his business, which was true. But how much money had Darren made by the time June 6th rolled around? Well, here's what we know. Darren had already made $111,000 in the first 5 months of 1996. And if again we adjust for inflation, that is the equivalent of $213,363 present day. Additionally, during the trial, we learned that Darren had $20,000 in outstanding receivables for the business that he would later receive, and $8,000 in his business checking account. And out of that $8,000 were monies that he had not yet delineated to himself for his own paycheck. Now, during the trial, we also heard claims that the Routiers were mere moments away from foreclosure, which was compounded by the $5,000 loan that they were denied days prior. However, the claim that they were mere moments away from foreclosure is simply not true. How do I know? Well, for a period of a few years in the 2000s, I worked 2 jobs, one at a law firm and the other as a self-originating mortgage loan officer for a Fortune 500 bank. And banks do not foreclose after 2 months of non-payment. That's not how any of this works at all. It's a fairly lengthy process that usually takes a minimum of 4 months to initiate and usually no less than 6 months of non-payment before the foreclosure process is finalized. And if you've ever listened to financial shows like the Dave Ramsey Show, you've probably heard people who call in regularly to tell the host about how they make well over $300,000 and yet they are somehow in unimaginable amounts of debt. It happens to millions of Americans every single day. People who make great money and yet still somehow live paycheck to paycheck. And those same people often resort to doing things like selling their jewelry, looking for debt consolidation loans, or whatever is needed to ensure that they can continue to make ends meet. But the idea that the Routiers were somehow on the doorsteps of foreclosure and insolvency is neither accurate nor even remotely true. Especially when you consider the fact that just a few months later, Darren was able to pay the $90,000 retainer for his wife's new attorney, Douglas Mulder. And the claim of the Routiers' insolvency was continuously repeated by the prosecution at trial as one of the primary motives for the crime. But when you consider the fact that the boy's funeral cost the Routiers over $10,000, it is absurd to suggest that the crimes were motivated by their life insurance policies, which were nullified by the cost of the crime itself. At this point of my investigation, I realized that I was making strides up this massive mountain that was the case against Darlie Routier. But it was at this moment that I realized that I needed to get into the meat of the prosecution's case against her, because while these claims are easily countered with the truth, I needed to know just how far this would go. One of the very first things that I always look for when I investigate a case is how law enforcement evaluated all of the available evidence from the crime. And from the onset of my analysis of Darlie's case, it was crystal clear to me that law enforcement never seriously considered that an intruder had been responsible, and that they made up their minds within the first few hours after the crimes were committed before having any of the forensic evidence in their possession. The numerous reports of neighbors and friends of the family who had seen a black car stalking the Routier home multiple times before June 6th were seemingly ignored, and law enforcement never provided evidence that they investigated any leads related to those sightings, or anyone else for that matter. In fact, during Darlie's trial, James Cron testified that after a 20 to 30 minute walkthrough of the crime scene, he formed the belief that, and I quote, "there had not been an intruder entry through the window," unquote. During the trial, he was asked why he formed that opinion, and he said, "It's sort of a big picture. It's not any one thing. It was the overall scene, which primarily is the lack of evidence in many cases." Many who have defended James Cron's views over the years claim that his initial view didn't end his investigation, that he continued to evaluate the evidence at the scene. But he also testified that it was his opinion that the broken wine glass, quote, "looks to me like it had been broken there to simulate or stage an offense, that a member of the household broke it and planted it there," unquote. And he made this statement despite the fact that he hadn't completed any forensic testing at that early stage of his investigation that could in any way scientifically support his opinion, because he had already arrived at the conclusion that the crime scene was entirely staged and that Darlie was responsible. And sadly, we now know that Terry Labor and Bart Epstein differed in their analysis of the wine glass and believed that it had been broken while still in the wine rack. We also know that upon arriving, crime scene investigators would notice that the coffee table next to the couch where Darlie claimed that she was attacked showed signs that it had been moved, consistent with the struggle near the couch. One of the hallmarks of the prosecution's claims was that an intruder could not have committed the crime due to the lack of blood evidence leading out of the house and into the garage. But just for a moment, let's think about that logically. And just for now, let's assume that an intruder was responsible for this crime. So the intruder attacks the boys, then Darlie, and eventually Darlie wakes up and he runs off, dropping the knife as he leaves. Since that would mean that Darlie was injured on the couch and ran after the intruder, then there is no reason to believe that he would have left shoe imprints in blood throughout the kitchen, utility room, or the garage, since he was always in front of her, before she could have even left any blood for him to step in. But the prosecution also claimed that an intruder would have left evidence in the backyard, and while fleeing would have turned on the security light that would have stayed on for 18 minutes. But in the 1990s, I also owned several different types of security lights that were very commonly used during the time. And one thing I learned about them is that they were controlled by an external on and off switch. So if an intruder had been casing the house for several days, as was reported by several witnesses who saw a man in a black car sitting across from the Routier home, then he would have likely known about the light prior to entering or exiting the Routier home. Additionally, Darlie would later describe him as being very tall, so scaling the Routier's back wall wouldn't have been a challenge. But the claims that he would have had to have disturbed the mulch in the backyard are also exaggerated, because as an avid gardener myself for the last 40 years, and as a man who is 6'3" and built like a linebacker, I can very easily stand, jump, or even break dance on my mulch and not leave any significant impressions on it whatsoever. And all of these details that have always been characterized as indisputable, incontrovertible facts are simply subjective viewpoints adopted by the state precisely because they want to utilize these as details that are a means to establish guilt. But they are not empirical, scientific facts that do not have any possible, viable explanations whatsoever. Later on in the trial, one of the other claims made by the prosecution was that there had not been evidence consistent with an intruder dropping the knife, as there was no pattern shown by the blood evidence that supported Darlie's version of events. But expert Labor would later explain that blood coagulates very quickly outside of the body, and it is not a scientific certainty that if an intruder had dropped the knife, that there would have to have been an evidentiary pattern of the blade itself left behind. But I do have a bone to pick that I am absolutely tired of hearing whenever I listen to anyone discuss this case. Because another one of the most frequently repeated claims that has been made by the prosecution and every single person who has covered this case in favor of their evidence is the claim that the windowsill dust wasn't disturbed and that somehow proved that an intruder could not have gone through that window. And this is despite the fact that 2 decades ago, Darren was able to demonstrate how a tall man just like him is easily able to get in and out of that windowsill without disturbing any of the dust. But again, this outright misinformation is repeated time and time again, touted as gospel truth. And in reality, it's just lazy. Because it's not scientific evidence of any kind, and yet it is portrayed as though it is. And the more I looked into the state's evidence, I continued to find that their absolute assertions were not as rock solid as they had been portrayed during Darlie's trial. And yet, no matter how many times I saw clear moments that could have easily been corrected by an attentive defense lawyer, what I saw instead was the apparent absence of attorney Douglas Mulder, who failed to do what he had been hired to do from the very beginning, to competently defend his client. But it was at this moment that I realized that it was time to address the elephant in the room. From the very beginning of Darlie's trial, the state told the jury, the media, and the world that it would have been impossible for an intruder to have perpetrated this crime and not leave behind any forensic evidence whatsoever. And after the presentation of the state's evidence, it would have been difficult for anyone to surmise anything else. But I needed to know, was it possible for an intruder to have committed this crime and have left no forensic evidence behind? The answer just might surprise you. On March 2nd, 2008, a horrific crime was committed, ending the lives of 6 innocent people in Memphis, Tennessee. Thankfully, one of the children who was present during the brutal attack survived, but in the days following the attack, law enforcement were completely baffled by the crime scene. Forensic analysts would cover the entirety of the house where the crime took place, and eventually they came to the realization that they were unable to find any evidence, DNA or otherwise, that established the identity of the perpetrator. Law enforcement was bewildered. Despite the brutality and the viciousness of the crime, they had found no forensic evidence. Thankfully, the child who survived would eventually recover and was able to tell law enforcement exactly who had committed the unspeakable acts, and investigators were shocked by who he named as the culprit. It was a man the boy had loved and respected his whole life. He named his uncle Jesse Dotson. But what was more alarming to law enforcement was that Dotson had been in the home for many hours prior to the vicious attack, and yet somehow had not left any forensic evidence that definitively connected him to the crime scene. Despite the lack of material evidence against Dotson, he would not escape justice and eventually received 6 death sentences for his crimes, 1 for each of the lives he stole that night. But what surprised me the most about this story may already be obvious to you now. Somehow, a man who had spent the whole day in that house, who then committed vile and horrendous acts against his own family, had managed to not leave any forensic evidence in his wake. Someone who knew nothing of law enforcement procedures, crime scene analysis, or even how to cover up a crime was the same man who had been in that house the entire day and somehow did not leave a speck of forensic evidence proving that he was there. And this very issue speaks to the ongoing problem that we have discussed on this very channel in the past, the CSI effect, where we often wrongly believe that DNA or other forensic evidence must be present if or when a crime is committed. And yet, as we now know, that is often not the case. So the absence of forensic evidence is not definitive proof of the absence of an intruder. Because if it was, Jesse Dotson might still be free. But I understood why so many people, myself included in the beginning, dismissed the idea of an intruder because of the lack of forensic evidence. But the fact remains that a crime involving an intruder breaking into a home, taking a weapon from inside of the victim's property, and using it to commit unspeakable crimes, that these seemingly random crimes do happen, and to the families who have been devastated by them, they are not a work of fiction. But at this point of my investigation, I knew that I could not stop here. I was more than halfway up the mountain, and I would not be satisfied until I knew if there was a truly insurmountable problem in her defense. But it was what I was about to find within the pages of her trial record that would definitively answer my questions concerning the veracity of Darlie Routier's conviction. You don't have to spend much time studying Darlie's case before you are confronted by the infamous bread knife evidence that has ostensibly been described as the forensic equivalent of a smoking gun. But as usual, I needed to know that for myself, so again I read the trial transcripts, and I almost couldn't believe the words that I was reading on the page. In Prosecutor Greg Davis's closing statements to the jury, he would summarize the forensic evidence brought against Darlie during the expert testimony of Charles Lynch concerning the bread knife. The following are the exact words of Prosecutor Greg Davis. And when Charles Lynch tested that bread knife, he looked at it under the microscope. And what did he find? Glass rods, the same type of rubber material seen on the bread knife, and the same type of rubber debris with the glass meshed in. The same type of stuff that happens when you cut the screen. And it adds up. That bread knife was used to cut that screen, and that tells you that they were trying to fake the crime scene. Now, I try to imagine how I would have felt hearing those words from a prosecutor who spoke with such conviction about the testimony surrounding the bread knife. I imagine that the jurors were compelled by this evidence because it seems obvious that what Charles Lynch found is beyond reproach and is indisputable. So I went back to Charles Lynch's testimony, reading the words from the transcript, and I just sat there in complete and utter disgust. Because this is what Charles Lynch actually said during his testimony concerning the testing of the bread knife. Question: bottom line, from this comparison of the black rubbery material and the glass rods on the window screen and on this knife, what does that say to you as a trace evidence analyst? Answer: I couldn't tell the difference between this debris and the debris found on the knife, and therefore, this knife could have been used to cause the cut defect. Now, you may already notice the stark difference between expert Lynch's statement that the cut window screen could have been caused by the bread knife and prosecutor Davis's closing statements that said that the bread knife was used to cut that screen. These are two entirely different statements with completely different meanings, and yet somehow in every iteration of every documentary ever created that claims Darlie is guilty, 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 I have never once ever seen anyone make this distinction. And surprise, surprise, there's more, because prior to conducting his tests, the bread knife was dusted using a fiberglass brush composed of similar material as the fiber found on the knife. And neither the state nor the defense ever conducted definitive testing on the fibers to determine their chemical or structural composition that would have conclusively determined if those fibers were in fact from the window screen. And if I'm playing the role of the devil's advocate, then I couldn't help but notice that the state's expert, Charles Lynch, was relying on his eyesight to make an absolute determination that was not scientifically possible without additional conclusive testing. And the claims that the fiberglass rods found on the fingerprinting brush were not the same size is not science. And this is because of the fact that fibers on fingerprinting brushes often vary in size throughout the entire brush. But did Lynch offer any scientific analysis of the fibers? Or how about a report that showed the exact size of the fibers and compared them to each of the fibers in the fingerprinting brush, which again vary in size? A scientific analysis which could have easily been completed in any one of their several labs. Well, in fact, he did none of those things. What he offered on the stand is the literal definition of a subjective opinion by someone who has been hired by the state to testify against their defendant. Especially when you consider what I'm about to tell you about his previous experience and other problematic issues arising from his other analysis of key evidence prior to Darlie's trial. Strap in, because this is about to be a wild ride. At the time of Darlie's trial, Charles Lynch wasn't even a certified fiber analysis expert in this specific field of forensic science. He had previously exclusively worked as a microscopic hair analyst that requires different certification entirely. And the state's star expert, Charles Lynch, hadn't even taken the proficiency test expected of an expert in hair and fiber analysis, which is the very minimum expectation of a forensic expert in his field. Because if we just think about his testimony logically, he has predicated his opinion of the evidence entirely based on what he sees. And that's the thing about trace evidence. We now know, after decades of wrongful expert testimony concerning fingerprint evidence, that it is not the pinnacle of forensic science that it was always purported to be. And I would think that before we execute someone for a crime, that we collectively would want a degree of scientific certainty that doesn't rely on the eyesight of a man, Charles Lynch, who was previously involuntarily committed to a mental institution for alcoholism and depression in the years leading up to Darlie's trial. And irrespective of your belief of Darlie's guilt or innocence, I would hope that each of us would want empirical testing that can definitively prove the evidence that is sending someone to death row. Why that is the exception and not the rule is absolutely beyond me. And again, it still doesn't even end there either. Because in August of 1996, during Darlie's bond hearing, Charles Lynch would testify in court that a hair microscopically similar to Darlie Routier's was found in the same windowsill that she had said an intruder had entered. At the time, this was absolutely damning evidence that the state used to prevent Darlie from bonding out of jail. Evidence that was going to be one of the pillars of the prosecution's case against Darlie. And I want to be very clear, Charles Lynch, the state's expert, had looked under a microscope and told the court that the state had evidence of her hair similar to Darlie's found in the window screen that implicated her in the crime, and his testimony kept her in jail. But a few short months later, guess what the state found out? The DNA test results of the hair that the state had already confidently declared to the judge was Darlie's came back. And surprise, surprise, it didn't belong to Darlie at all. It belonged to a female Rowlett Police Department officer who had contaminated the crime scene with her own hair. And you already know what I'm going to say, because it still doesn't end there. Because the expert testimony of Charles Lynch also helped to convict and incarcerate 4 people that we know of who were later exonerated for crimes that they did not commit. Convictions that were predicated on the testimony of the same man who was the star trace evidence expert for the state at Darlie Routier's trial. Now just try to imagine what the jury would have thought had they heard the whole and complete story, a story that the prosecutors conveniently never bothered to tell them. And a similar problem existed with the blood spatter evidence in Darlie's trial. Evidence that was presented by expert Tom Bevel as irrefutable fact has since been shown to be inconsistent with the state's own theory of the crime. In fact, in this video, we can plainly see Tom Bevel demonstrating the state's explanation for how the boy's blood ended up on Darlie's shirt. But do I even need to explain how odd this is? Because he's saying that the evidence found on the back of Darlie's shirt was dropped there during this motion? But I noticed in the trial record that prior to law enforcement arriving, Darlie had rushed over to help Darren with the boys. Darren explained during trial that Darlie was holding Damon's wounds closed as he continued with CPR, and air could be heard coming out of his wounds. So once again, it only takes a modicum of logical thinking to see how CPR compressions, which are literally causing air to rapidly leave the open wounds, could have easily resulted in the blood evidence that ended up on Darlie's shirt. And after months of reading every imaginable record I could find on her case, I had yet to come across any evidence that convinced me that the state had succeeded in proving their case. But at this point, I had made it so far up the mountain, and yet I was about to find exactly what had convinced the jury, and what I found there was completely heartbreaking. In the days after June 6th, Darlie would eventually leave the hospital and begin to prepare for Damon and Devon's funeral. By this point in time, the Rowlett Police Department, a law enforcement agency that had never previously dealt with a homicide case of this magnitude, had begun to surveil the Routiers at every possible opportunity. While they were already thoroughly convinced that Darlie was the culprit, they still needed more evidence to support their suspicions. Normally, when a law enforcement agency is attempting to build a case against a criminal defendant, they petition the presiding judge for the warrants they need in order to obtain the evidence needed to support their case. And for the most part, judges will grant these warrants with very few exceptions. But it would seem that Darlie Routier's case was built on a foundation of exceptions. exceptions that even the Rowlett Police Department would be forced to reckon with. Normally, wiretap warrants requested within the framework of the law are given to law enforcement at their request and without many exclusions. There are, however, certain times, conversations, and locations that are considered sacrosanct even during a criminal investigation involving capital murder charges. Those exceptions typically vary, but for the most part, they include important places where the privacy of the defendant is absolute. But it would seem that the Rowlett Police Department would not be deterred by the law, the Constitution, or the rules that govern their ability to surveil Darlie Routier. So lead homicide detective Jimmy Patterson decided that he would supersede the need for a judge's permission to wiretap the Routiers and chose instead to simply break the law. Detective Patterson would ask permission of the cemetery owner to install a recording device at the location where the Routiers were about to hold the funeral for their boys Damon and Devin. Confident that he would catch Darlie in a stunning confession, proving her guilt and sealing up their case against the unsuspecting mother. But when the day of the funeral arrived and the Rowlett Police Department retrieved the recording, they realized that they had less than nothing on that tape. What they had were the sobs of a grieving mother and family saying goodbye to their eldest boys far too soon. So when it came time for Darlie's trial, for once, the defense wisely cross-examined Detective Patterson in an effort to ascertain why he had crossed the line and so clearly broken the law. But it was his response that left the jury, the defense, and the media stunned. He simply pled the fifth. And despite the unprecedented debacle by law enforcement, the judge summarily denied the request for a mistrial. Now, I have tried to recall a moment in time when I had encountered anything that even comes close to this kind of misconduct by a lead investigator in a capital murder case. In fact, in the combined history of all the cases I have ever touched or worked on, I have never once heard of a lead investigator pleading the fifth in connection to a case that he or she investigated. And the claim that he pled the fifth so as not to incriminate himself is often said as though it somehow excuses his unlawful behavior. Law enforcement does not get to break the law regardless of their intent or whom it is aimed at. The fact remains that the actions of Detective Patterson were not simply unprecedented or uncommon. His actions represented a department seemingly hell-bent on the conviction of a defendant that they had already deemed guilty. And they were willing to go to any lengths, even breaking the law to ensure her conviction. And it is my view that this issue alone should have been weighed more substantially by both Darlie's trial judge and the appellate court. But the problem of an overzealous law enforcement agency would not end there. In fact, a bloody footprint was found in the garage of the Routier home, and James Cron would later state that he identified the footprint belonging to none other than a member of the Rowlett Police Department. So by this point, we now have a second time that we know of where the Rowlett Police Department has contaminated their own crime scene. And every time they present evidence to the court that they insist is beyond reproach, they expect the jury, the media, and everyone else to ignore their mistakes and believe without question that their mistakes begin and end there. But unfortunately, the failures by law enforcement and the state would not end after a few bungled crime scene mishaps. In fact, their mistakes persisted and would culminate in one of the most egregious and prejudicial examples of prosecutorial misconduct that I have seen in my career. Leading up to the trial, prosecutors would call the entire medical staff who treated Darlie, people who were still set to testify in her upcoming trial, and they were asked to come to a local hotel for a pretrial meeting. Upon arriving, each of the medical staff were then sat down in a conference room as a group. It was at this time that the prosecutors showed each of the medical personnel graphic crime scene photos from the aftermath of June 6th. The photos included detailed and horrifying pictures of each of the Routier boys, including detailed pictures from the crime scene. And to absolutely no one's surprise, the medical staff left that meeting and eventually each one would testify in virtual unison at trial. They would all describe Darlie to the jury as uncaring, detached, even using the same words to describe her, words that they had never used in their own medical record notations at the time of her hospitalization, including routinely referring to her as being whiny. And this was despite the fact that their own handwritten medical notes stated that Darlie had been seen excessively crying, asking why someone would do this to her boys, including notes stating that she was inconsolable. But now, all of a sudden at trial, the medical staff is testifying that they hadn't seen Darlie demonstrate any signs of crying, sadness, or evidence indicative of a mother grieving a tragic loss. You know, it's almost like the meeting that they had with prosecutors drastically impacted and prejudiced each of them against a woman standing trial for crimes that they had been shown in graphic detail. Because the fact of the matter is, one of two things must be true: that they were either all lying in their own medical records before they knew anything about her alleged involvement in the crime, or they were all exaggerating or committing outright perjury during Darlie's trial. Both cannot be true at the same time. Now, over the years, people who have defended the prosecutor's decision to meet with the medical staff have claimed that these pre-trial meetings are the norm within the criminal justice system. But I contend that the norm can and clearly does have a deleterious impact on the mindset of anyone set to testify against any defendant, especially when you show those people pictures of what that defendant, who still has the presumption of innocence, is accused of doing. It is human nature that when we see evidence of a heinous crime, to do whatever we can to protect innocence. So while I don't necessarily blame the medical staff whose testimony magically changed from their own records at trial, I do blame the prosecutors for underhanded behavior that flies in the face of a fair and objective judiciary that assumes that a defendant is innocent until proven guilty. And just because something is the norm does not make it right. Because the fact of the matter is that numerous people did testify to having seen Darlie devastated and distraught over the loss of Damon and Devin, including the medical staff who treated her courtesy of their own handwritten medical records. But the prejudice that stemmed from the improper use of evidence was only the beginning, because the prosecution was about to show the jury the ace up their sleeve that would guarantee that they would convict Darlie Lynn Routier beyond any reasonable doubt. Prosecutor Greg Davis knew from the moment he stepped through the courtroom doors exactly who he needed to convince of the state's case. It wasn't the media, it wasn't the judge, or even the Routier family. He knew that he had a 12-panel jury comprised of some of the most socially and politically conservative people in the country. He knew that he was in a county that regularly boasted their 95% conviction rate, comprised of people who took their faith very seriously. It was precisely why he didn't hesitate to quote the Bible and speak of Darlie as the literal incarnation of evil, because he knew that he wouldn't need to convince an appellate court to ignore his prosecutorial misconduct. He already knew they would. Because it's a well-known, unspoken rule that the courts in that region of the United States regularly uphold the convictions of defendants regardless of the merits or wrongdoing that created them. And it's precisely the reason why the United States of America is number one in a category that no one else comes even close in comparison. The statistical fact that we have the highest incarceration rate in the entire world. Prosecutor Davis was only ever interested in a campaign designed to enrage the jury, to prey on their predilections, and to achieve something even more important than all of the forensic evidence combined. More than anything, he wanted the hearts and minds of the jury, and the evidence that he succeeded in that effort can still be found in the words of the jurors from Darlie Routier's trial to this very day. 5 years ago, juror number 8, Carrie Paris, participated in a documentary about Darlie's trial created by ABC called The Last Defense. In it, she said something truly remarkable about her experience as a juror in Darlie's trial. She said, and I quote, "I just knew that she was young and that she killed her boys." What a remarkably honest thing to say, and such an insightful look into the travesty that is the justice system for far too many people. Because from the very moment she sat in that seat as a juror, she already assumed that Darlie had committed the crime. She didn't say, "I just knew that she was young and that she was accused of killing her boys." Her statement seemed to be a declaration of what she already believed about Darlie. But I'll relent that maybe it's possible that my assessment is an overly analytical argument over semantics. But then again, maybe not. Listen to what juror Carrie Paris said when she was asked about the testimony of friends and family of Darlie who told the court about Darlie's love and affection for her boys. Quote, "I don't think she was as doting as people said she was. I don't. She's not so much doting on her kids as she is doting on herself. Who goes out and spends $2,000 on a set of breasts? That was one of the things that really caught our attention. Pictures that we saw of the clothes she was wearing, very flashy. Expensive clothes, jewelry. I don't buy any of that stuff, but she bought a lot of that stuff." End quote. Now you may be tempted to think, well, that was just one of the jurors. They certainly didn't all have such wildly judgmental and subjective things to say about Darlie's character that had nothing whatsoever to do with the crime that she was accused of. Well, let's see. Rena Way was also a juror during Darlie's trial, and during the same Lisa Gibbons episode that I previously mentioned, she would say the following about Darlie during the taping of the show.
I believe that Devin kicked the crap out of her. You understand that? The only way that he's going to get a wound on his butt if he is being stabbed in the chest is if he has his feet up and he is kicking. He's
Since the trial, we've learned that jurors paid special attention to one singular thing, something that was so convincing that it could easily be argued was the actual smoking gun in the state's case against Darlie. And now we have finally arrived at the most important moment of the state's entire case against Darlie Routier. Evidence so moving and powerful that juror Charles Sanford has since stated in a signed affidavit that it was precisely because of the fact that the prosecution showed this evidence so many times during the trial that it was the main reason that he voted to convict Darlie. But juror Sanford would also say in his affidavit that if he had seen the complete funeral footage from that day, that he would have not voted to convict her. So it wasn't the forensic evidence, or the circumstantial evidence, or a bread knife, or rags, or a sock, or changing stories about the crime, or even the testimony by people claiming Darlie was a bad mother, or anything else brought by the state during her trial that convinced the jury. But it was this VHS tape, evidence that they would watch 7 different times during their 4-hour jury deliberation, that would ultimately convince them to convict Darlie Lynn Routier beyond any reasonable doubt. I still remember the moment like it was yesterday when I got the call that my grandfather had died. He wasn't like a father to me. He was a father to me. And when the cancer finally took him, it broke me. I knew that he wasn't going to live forever, but a childlike part of me wished he had. Because from the day I was born, he was there. He had always been there for me. From my early adolescence, every summer I would go and stay with him at his house. Every day was an adventure filled with stories and laughter for hours into the night, spending days getting lost in the arroyos, spending nights learning from him what it meant to be a man. So when the day came to have his funeral, I remember just how much my heart hurt standing outside of that church. I couldn't muster the courage to go inside, mainly because I had lost all control over the grief. I don't ever recall crying like that in my entire life. But later that day, when we got together as a family, despite our hurt, we celebrated because we knew that was what he would have wanted. That was the way we chose to honor him, not because of his death, but because of his life. And if there had been news crews and cameras recording that moment and you had seen it for yourself, it may not have made any sense to you. A family grieving the loss of someone we loved more than life itself, and yet we were dancing, laughing, remembering the life that he lived and the profound impact of that life on each of us. To many people, it may have seemed disrespectful or even inappropriate, and to any who would have thought that, all I would say is this: you didn't know him the way I did, because you would not have been able to see with your eyes the heaviness of my heart in that moment. But if it were possible for you to have felt the weight of that loss, then there would have been no doubt the hole his absence left behind, and how much I will always miss and love that man. And the truth is, I don't need to defend Darlie Routier, and I don't need to come up with explanations for how she chose to grieve, because they very well may not be the things that you or I would do. But for me, judging her guilt or innocence and sending her to death row based on how well she grieved, that is beyond the pale. A few months before I was born, my grandmother died from complications arising from her lifelong battle with COPD asthma. She would leave us at just 45 years old. As a teenager, I had never seen my grandfather cry. The same man who loved to dance, who always had a smile, and who loved fiercely, had experienced a life-altering tragedy that he hid behind a wall of strength. Growing up, he rarely spoke of her. He never seemed to show any significant outward appearance of his grief, but I always knew that he missed her dearly. Years later, when I became an adult, there was a time when I brought my guitar to his house. I had always heard that he was a prolific guitarist, so I asked him to play. He looked at me, and doing his best to compose himself, he explained that on the day that my grandmother passed, he put down his guitar, an instrument that he had always used to sing to her, something that was a part of their love story, and that very day, he chose to never play again. That was the day I saw my grandfather cry, a day that I learned a very important lesson about loss. I learned to never assume that you know someone's pain based on their expressions alone. Because sometimes the person smiling and carrying on is the same person who is caring for their remaining loved ones by staying strong. Because the reality is that they are actually carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders, and they are doing everything in their power to hide it. When I had finally reached the end of my journey, I looked back down the mountain, seeing the months of reading, scouring court records, and combing through every imaginable detail I could find on Darlie's case. But before I could summit the final few steps up this seemingly impossible climb, I had to be certain that I could make it the rest of the way. So I began my final ascent. Taking my first step, I found within the record statements from family members who discussed Darlie's condition in the days after she came home from the hospital. They explained how she had refused to go anywhere by herself, that she was absolutely terrified of being alone, of being attacked again. She even asked family members to follow her to every room of the house because of how gripping that fear had become. Another step, as the summit becomes more clear, I listened to all of the characterizations of Darlie's breast implants over and over again. The countless times that she was accused of being vain, materialistic, and money-hungry, something that today would be dismissed as ignorant hate speech. But I persisted, listening to the claims of a motive that did not fit the evidence, and attacks on her character that had nothing legally to do with the charges against her. I listened as the prosecutor attacked her as a failed, abusive, and degenerate mother who did not love her children. Then watching Darlie in countless home videos loving on her boys, and in interviews after her incarceration, taking every chance she had to send messages to her only remaining child, Drake. completely unfocused on herself, but on the needs of a child who grew up without his mom, seemingly desperate to remind him that even though she couldn't be there for him, that she loves him seemingly more than life itself. And then I tried to imagine what it would have been like if my own mother had been judged so harshly at her worst moments. Another step, and I'm nearly there now. I read the innumerable times Darlie was mocked by prosecutors, by the media, and even YouTube content creators. People calling her a dangerous and deranged psychopath without so much as a qualified assessment from any of her treating mental health providers agreeing with that characterization whatsoever. Observing as these same people laugh and mock her as she sings to her son. A son that she was forced to watch suffer with leukemia after he was diagnosed at the age of 17. Unable to comfort him or touch him through the thick glass, desperate to soothe her child as he fought for his life during chemotherapy. Trying to comprehend how I would feel if any one of my daughters or my fiancé was scrutinized that same way, where somehow it's appropriate and even acceptable to discuss a woman's weight, her body, her clothing, or how she chooses to live her life. I could see that the summit is feet away now, and I look out into a world that so many women have been forced to live in, where they are often not believed, assumed to be lying, presumed that if they wear certain clothes or act a certain way, or worst of all, if they are not religious and don't attend church regularly, then whatever happened to them is somehow their fault. Where if they don't emulate the expectations of their conservative community and demonstrate the life of a good and virtuous Christian woman, then guilt is virtually assumed. I see a world my loved ones live in where women are routinely fearful of going out by themselves, where men decide what they can or cannot do with their own bodies, where they are afraid of being attacked or assaulted and then blamed by the world for bringing it on themselves and shamed for the crimes committed against them. And by the time I stepped onto the summit, I remembered hearing about when the state took Drake away from his family. When CPS went to the home of Darlie and Darren Routier and took Drake from Darren, and not because he had failed at his duties as a father or because of allegations of wrongdoing by either parent, but because Darren had the audacity to continue to support his wife, Darlie. And as a consequence of that support, CPS took Darlie's child from her, from Darren, and told him to his face that a man that could still support Darlie was not fit to be a parent. It was so clear that the justice system had made up their mind from the beginning, forming a vendetta against the Routiers, and that you would have to ignore the literal mountain of evidence that I was now standing on in order to not see that. That's so much of the reason why people believe her to be guilty is because the state never bothered to look anywhere else. And the cold, harsh reality is that law enforcement, the prosecutors, and ultimately the jury did not convict Darlie based on empirical scientific evidence, but by the jury's own admission chose to send her to death row because of a video that in their 4-hour deliberation they would watch and rewatch 7 times over. A jury who chose to cast judgment on Darlie for her perceived failure to appropriately grieve the loss of her sons. A jury that was never shown the rest of that day at the funeral site where Darlie had spent the preceding hours at the boy's gravesite, shattered, broken, and sobbing. Standing there on top of the mountain that became Darlie's trial and conviction, I remembered how I felt in the beginning, because I truly never thought I would be able to reach the top and find my own answers to the questions that Darlie's jury had answered so quickly. A case that took me months to read and fully understand was somehow decided in a handful of hours by a jury who had not been told the whole truth. I stood there realizing that I had found answers that I never intended on finding, answers that weren't based on unprovable conjecture or obscure conspiracy theories, but just the available facts. Facts that told me everything I needed to know. But more importantly than what I found was the realization that it wasn't time for me to answer those two questions. It was time for you to answer them. Several months ago, I asked our community which case they wanted me to investigate next. The resounding answer was the case and trial of Darlie Routier. But I could not have imagined where my investigation would eventually lead. A journey that began with such certainty and determination would take an unexpected turn that would call into question my most fundamental beliefs of the entirety of the criminal justice system. But while I may have narrated my own journey through this case, the story is incomplete without you. So I would like to ask you to answer those questions we started with from the very beginning, to write in the comments section your answers, and as a juror, cast your vote for the following questions we began with. 1. Do you find that Darlie Lynn Routier is guilty beyond any reasonable doubt? And 2. Does Darlie Routier deserve the death penalty? Now, I realize that it would be very easy to see this exercise as a fruitless endeavor without any real-world impact, but I assure you it's not. Because one day, months, or even years from now, you may be called upon as a juror to be one of those 12 people who are given the awesome responsibility of deciding whether or not someone lives or dies. And my hope is that when that time comes and it's you that has to make that choice, that you will remember this moment, and that most of all, you will have the courage to follow your convictions and to allow the truth to guide you. I want to take a moment to thank those of you who have taken the time to listen to this entire episode, and for affording me such an incredible amount of your time, and for the patience as I worked over the last several months to put this together. I know that going through this case has not been easy, and it isn't the jovial and lighthearted journey that we are often accustomed to taking together. Some of you may be surprised to learn that it was not my intent to try and convince you of Darlie's innocence today. But if I'm being honest, more than anything, my goal was to passionately advocate for all of the victims of this case. By now, it's likely already obvious, but I will always advocate for equity within our justice system, regardless of the case or how that defendant is perceived. Because from the very moment I realized that Darlie's case met all of the criteria of someone who at the very least deserved a retrial, I also realized that my view of her case would likely be wildly unpopular with a large demographic of people who will always believe that Darlie is guilty, no matter what they are shown to disprove it. I realized that this video would likely mean that I would be on the receiving end of angry people who are not interested in the legal, ethical, and evidentiary reasons that support my view. But I don't create these videos for likes or followers or because I want to be the next popular true crime creator. The reality is that it would have been far easier for me to simply say that she was guilty, just like a majority of people have to this point, to simply ignore everything I saw in the trial record and simply go with the flow. It would have been much simpler for me to come down on Darlie, to be one of the many people along the way who claimed that her perceived failures and everything presented at trial was sufficient evidence to establish guilt beyond any reasonable doubt, and then send her off to death row without another thought. But I simply could not do that, not knowing what I now know, even if it meant losing followers or the good graces of this community, because that would require me to ignore the blatant misconduct, the legal and ethical wrongdoing, the mountain of contrary evidence to the state's case, and the fundamental violations of the rules that govern the entirety of our judicial system. And for me, no amount of internet clout is worth my integrity. Truthfully, and I mean this, I don't think I'm special. But I do think that this is long overdue, and if we have any hope of giving our children a better world than the one we found, we cannot allow or continue to ignore an injustice of this magnitude. For me, the bottom line is very simple, because it doesn't matter who the person is. If we are not willing to fairly evaluate both sides of a criminal action honestly, sincerely, and with veracity, then we will continue to witness headlines of posthumously exonerated death row inmates for decades to come. A crimson stain that I believe we will never wash away, no matter how much time passes over it. At the onset of my analysis, I understood why so many people believe Darlie is guilty and deserves the punishment that was levied against her. But now, having read every page of every document that came from her trial, her appeals, and then listening to every iteration from every story that has covered her case, podcast included, a question kept creeping up in the back of my mind, even when I was still convinced that she was responsible. And by the time I finished studying the totality of her case, that question was the only thing that remained. Because no matter how many times I've listened to or watched media that has discussed her case, far too few people have ever considered the weight of this question. In fact, I can guarantee you that despite everything I just shared with you, there will still be countless people who will completely disregard all of it. Because one of the most difficult parts of our humanity to overcome is when we are faced with evidence that challenges fundamental beliefs that we have held for many years. When we are told that something we believe may be wrong. But when you look out into the world around us and see the current state of our justice system, an institution that was supposed to be built on a foundation of presumed innocence, it calls out to us to right the wrongs of the past and to be willing to ask these questions. A question that for me was the last and final piece of the puzzle that I found buried underneath the weight of Darlie's conviction. A question that I believe we cannot afford not to ask. So I'll go ahead and ask the question. What if, for the last 27 years, Darlie Lynn Routier has been telling the truth this whole time? And what if she did not commit this crime? Because if we really allow ourselves to ask that question, taking into consideration everything we just learned, the weight and pain of the answer, it's unfathomable. Because it would mean that every single time that people have labeled her a monster, a liar, a sociopath, a family killer, it would mean that every single one of those people were wrong. And that she has spent the last 27 years of her life on death row for a crime that someone else perpetrated against her and her children. And I categorically refuse to be one of the many people who have cast stones at a woman who continues to maintain her innocence, knowing what I now know. And I believe that question is one that Liddell Lee wished prosecutors, appellate judges, and the jurors who sentenced him to death row had asked sincerely before they signed off on his death warrant. But the truth is, no matter how you answer that question, the fact still remains that the accused, convicted, and sentenced to death row prisoner number 999220, Darlie Lynn Routier, she is an inmate, but she is also a friend, a mother, and a woman whose story that I believe. And she is quickly running out of time. It's almost hard to believe that creating this video took as much time as it did. But for me, getting to this point was worth every minute of every hour that it took. But even still, I want to thank each of you for taking the time to allow me to share that journey with you today. Now, I understand that some of you will passionately disagree with me, and that's okay. We can disagree. But I do want to say one last thing concerning this case. My belief in Darlie Routier's innocence is absolute, especially now that I have seen the trial records for myself. Please understand that I encourage every person to review the case and make their own determination, but my perspective is my own, and I will continue to advocate for Devin, Damon, and Darlie for as long as I have breath. But I do want to thank each of you for granting me an audience. Even though some of us will inevitably not see eye to eye, I still want to thank you for your time and for your thoughtful consideration concerning a case that for me has been transformative in more ways than one. Now, as many of you may already know, the last several months also brought some unique challenges to my life. In early February, I became very ill, and I am still in the process of trying to manage my ongoing health problems. However, it was during that time that so many of you went out of your way to express support, posting kind messages, and offering words of encouragement. And to each of you, I just want to say thank you for helping renew my faith in humanity and for reminding me how truly exceptional so many of you in this community truly are. Concerning new content on the channel, for the foreseeable future, I am going back to making shorter videos that don't take well over 600 hours to create, which means we will be returning to a regular upload schedule starting next week. Also, I have seen the many requests for follow-up videos to prior series I've already covered, so in the next few weeks, I will be doing exactly that. Additionally, I will be adding a new focus to this channel to start highlighting cases like Darlie's, which I believe need to be brought to the forefront of the entire true crime community. So expect to see new and follow-up cases coming in the next few weeks. Now, I want to take a moment to personally and profusely thank my Patreon and YouTube supporters. The fact that so many of you continued to believe in me as I worked on this case during my recovery is nothing short of remarkable. This content is a reflection of my gratitude and my way of saying thank you for your kindness and support. It is because of each of you that I am able to do what I truly love. I also want to take a moment to thank my fiancée for her love and support over the last several months. It is not an exaggeration to say that you continue to help me through a very painful and challenging time. Thank you for being the woman that you are. I love you endlessly, and I am truly a better man because of you. Now, before we close, I have one final request. As trite as it may seem, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. Each of those things are profound ways for you to show support for this channel and so that more people can have the opportunity to hear this story. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of the BCM community, for supporting me and this channel, and most of all, for the gift of your time. It is a gift that I will truly never cease being grateful for. So as always, this has been Behind Criminal Minds. We'll see you next time.